I am Sienna, 29 years old, and yesterday I buried the only father who ever truly loved me. But as I stood by his casket delivering my eulogy, a woman I had not seen in 20 years burst through the chapel doors and slapped me across the face. She screamed that I was a manipulative gold digger stealing an $80 million fortune from my real blood family. What she did not know was that my adoptive father had already anticipated their greed, and the trap he laid for them was going to destroy their lives completely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who only want you for what you can give them. The air inside the memorial chapel was heavy with the scent of white lilies and quiet respect. Winston, my adoptive father, was a titan of commercial real estate, a self-made billionaire who built an empire from nothing but grit and an unparalleled understanding of market value. He was also the man who found me when I was 9 years old, shattered and abandoned in the foster system, and gave me a life I could never have imagined. Because of him, I grew up to become a ruthless and successful investment portfolio manager. I understood assets, I understood liabilities, and I understood that Winston was the greatest asset my heart had ever known. I stood at the mahogany podium, looking out at a sea of dark suits and somber faces. The city's most powerful developers, politicians, and business leaders had gathered to pay their respects. I took a deep breath, my hands gripping the edges of the podium, as I began to speak about the man who taught me how to read financial ledgers before I could drive. I was halfway through my eulogy, my voice steady, despite the crushing grief in my chest, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel slammed open. The sound echoed like a gunshot against the vaulted ceilings. Every head in the room turned. Striding down the center aisle was a woman I had not laid eyes on in 2 decades. Brenda Caldwell, my biological mother. She was dressed in a cheap, overly flashy black suit that screamed of desperate attempts to look wealthy. Her heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor, completely shattering the dignified silence of the memorial. I froze the microphone, picking up my sharp intake of breath. I had spent 20 years erasing this woman from my mind. I had built a fortress of professional success and financial independence to ensure I would never have to think about the people who threw me away. Yet here she was, marching toward the altar, with a face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. Before I could signal the security guards standing near the side exits, Brenda reached the front. She did not look at Winston's casket. She did not acknowledge the grieving crowd. She lunged forward, raised her hand, and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the microphone, amplifying the violence across the entire chapel. Gasps erupted from the front rows. My cheek burned with a fiery, stinging heat, but I did not fall. I planted my feet, my training in high-stakes corporate boardrooms kicking in instantly. I did not shed a tear. I simply turned my head back to face her, staring into the eyes of the woman who had birthed me. "You thought you could just take everything," Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the stained glass windows. "You thought you could manipulate this old man, swoop in and steal $80 million from your own flesh and blood. You are nothing but a greedy little thief." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. The wealthy attendees murmured in shock, unsure of how to react to this grotesque display. I touched my burning cheek, my eyes narrowing. Flesh and blood. I repeated, my voice deathly calm, projecting clearly through the microphone for every single person in the room to hear. "You want to talk about flesh and blood right now, Brenda? You want to talk about the flesh and blood you left sitting on the curb of a Sunoco gas station in the freezing rain 20 years ago?" Brenda's face flinched, but her greed quickly overrode any microscopic shred of shame she might have harbored. "We had no choice," she yelled, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my chest. "We had no money. Cameron needed us. He was the boy. He was the one who needed the resources to succeed. You were just a girl. You were a burden we could not afford." The chapel went dead silent. The absolute cruelty of her admissions screamed over the casket of a billionaire was staggering. She was openly admitting that she and my biological father, Richard Caldwell, had discarded their 9-year-old daughter like actual garbage simply because I was female, choosing to hoard their meager finances for their golden child son, Cameron. I still remembered the smell of gasoline and cheap coffee from that night. I remembered holding a broken crayon and a coloring book waiting for hours until the police arrived, realizing my parents were never coming back. And now I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. 20 years later, you read an obituary in the Financial Times and decided to play the grieving mother. You abandoned me to the foster system because I was a girl. Winston took me in. He raised me. He paid for my education. He taught me how to manage investment portfolios worth more than you will ever see in a dozen lifetimes. He was my father. You are just the woman who abandoned me at a gas station. You owe us! Brenda shrieked, slamming her hands against the mahogany podium. We gave you life. If we had not left you, that billionaire would never have found you. You owe your entire fortune to the sacrifice we made. That $80 million belongs to this family. It belongs to Cameron. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the twisted, toxic logic she had constructed in her head. She honestly believed that her act of horrific child abandonment was a favor, a strategic move that entitled her to the commercial real estate empire my adoptive father had spent 50 years building. She looked at me not as a daughter she had lost and found, but as a walking bank vault, a lottery ticket she intended to cash in. Security, I said firmly into the microphone, my eyes never leaving Brenda's furious face. Please remove this woman from the premises. Two large men in dark suits immediately stepped out from the shadows of the side aisles, moving quickly toward the altar. Brenda realized she was about to be forcibly dragged out of the chapel, but instead of retreating, a smug, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She crossed her arms, looking past me toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, completely unfazed by the guards approaching her, entirely confident in whatever backup she had waiting in the wings. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open for a second time, hitting the stone walls with a resounding thud. Two men strode through the entryway, their footsteps echoing in perfect sync with the chaotic energy Brenda had just unleashed. I recognized them instantly, even though 20 years had etched new lines into their faces. Richard Caldwell, the biological father who had driven the car away from that gas station, and Cameron, the 27-year-old golden child for whom my existence had been sacrificed. Richard wore a suit that was visibly outdated, struggling to project an aura of wealth that he clearly did not possess. Beside him, Cameron looked every bit the pampered prince my parents had sacrificed me to create. His suit was flashy, desperate, the kind of attire worn by a man drowning in debt, but frantic to maintain an illusion of status. They marched down the center aisle, their eyes locked on me entirely, ignoring the mourners surrounding them. The security guards hesitated, glancing at me for confirmation as the situation rapidly escalated from a lone intruder to a coordinated family ambush. I gave a sharp, definitive nod, silently ordering them to proceed, but Cameron was already launching into his rehearsed performance. Sienna Cameron cried out, his voice cracking with a manufactured grief that belonged on a cheap soap opera set. He threw his hands out, looking around at the bewildered crowd of real estate moguls and investment bankers. We have been looking for you for decades. Our parents never stopped searching. This billionaire, this man in the box, he kept you hidden from us. He bought you and kept you away from your real family. A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the pews. Cameron was good. I had to give him that. He knew exactly how to play the victim, twisting the narrative to make Winston look like a predatory villain and the Caldwells look like a tragic, broken family robbed of their daughter. He wiped a non-existent tear from his cheek, stepping closer to the altar, attempting to garner sympathy from a room full of people who managed billion-dollar hedge funds. He miscalculated his audience. These people dealt with corporate sharks daily. They recognized a cheap hustle when they saw one. I gripped the microphone, my knuckles turning white. I refused to let them turn my father's funeral into a chaotic circus sideshow. Do not dare speak his name, I commanded, my voice cutting through Cameron's fake sobs like a steel blade. Winston saved me from the gutter you threw me into. You did not spend decades looking for me. You spent decades ignoring my existence until you smelled the blood of an $80 million estate. You are 20 years too late to play the loving brother Cameron. Cameron faltered, the fake grief dropping from his face for a fraction of a second, revealing the panicked, entitled boy beneath. He looked at Richard, waiting for his cue. Richard stepped past his son, his posture arrogant and dripping with unearned confidence. He glared at the security guards who were now flanking Brenda, ready to physically escort her out. Do not touch my wife, Richard warned the guards, his tone laced with a pathetic attempt at authority. Then he turned his cold, calculating eyes on me. You always were an ungrateful little brat. We made a hard choice to ensure this family survived. We sacrificed so Cameron could have a future, and now it is time for you to repay that debt. You are delusional, I stated, stepping down from the podium to stand directly between Richard and Winston's casket. I owe you nothing. You are trespassing. I am giving you exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out those doors before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace. Instead of backing down, Richard let out a loud, grating laugh. He reached inside the breast pocket of his cheap suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal papers. His eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction that made my stomach turn. He did not hand the papers to me. He did not hand them to my lawyer. In an act of supreme, unforgivable disrespect, Richard stepped forward and slammed the legal documents directly onto the polished mahogany lid of Winston's casket. The sound cracked like a whip. Several attendees in the front row actually gasped aloud at the sheer audacity of the gesture. You are not throwing anyone out, Richard announced, his voice booming across the chapel so every wealthy investor and business partner could hear. And you are certainly not inheriting a single dime of this estate. I stared at the thick manila envelope resting on the floral arrangement atop the casket, my analytical mind racing to process the threat. Richard smirked, relishing the collective shock of the room. He pointed a finger at the documents, his chest puffed out with arrogant victory. We are your legal blood guardians, Richard declared to the crowd, basking in the chaotic energy he had manufactured. That old man thought he could just buy our daughter and rewrite the law. But he was sloppy. Those adoption papers from 20 years ago have a fatal flaw. We never legally surrendered our parental rights. Which means, as your only lawful next of kin, we are taking back what is ours. The chapel erupted into chaos. Whispers turned into loud exclamations. Brenda crossed her arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard and Cameron, looking at me with a sickening sense of ownership. They had not come here to reconnect. They had come here to lay claim to a fortune they felt entitled to simply because we shared DNA. I stood frozen, staring at the legal papers defiling my father's casket. My mind, usually capable of processing complex investment algorithms in seconds, struggled to comprehend the absolute sheer greed standing in front of me. They had abandoned me to starve to freeze to become a ward of the state. They had sacrificed my entire childhood to pamper a son who now stood beside them, eager to profit off my tragedy. This is an emergency court injunction, Richard sneered, leaning closer to me so only I could hear his next words over the rising noise of the crowd. Every bank account, every property, every single asset tied to Winston's name is officially frozen. You are locked out, Sienna. You do not have the power to kick us out of anywhere anymore. You belong to us again. My blood ran cold. The security guards hesitated once more, unsure of how to proceed against individuals claiming legal authority over the estate. The absolute audacity of the Caldwells had paralyzed the entire room. They were completely unashamed, wearing their greed like a badge of honor, willing to desecrate a funeral to secure their payday. The murmurs of the crowd grew into a chaotic hum. I looked from Brenda's smug grin to Cameron's eager eyes, and finally to Richard's triumphant sneer, realizing that the real war had just begun. Mitchell, Winston's longtime corporate attorney and my personal legal counsel, sliced through the murmuring crowd. He was a tall, imposing man who had navigated hostile takeovers and vicious corporate litigation for over 3 decades. His face was a mask of cold professionalism as he reached the altar. Without a single word to Richard, Mitchell picked up the thick manila envelope resting on the mahogany casket. The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the chapel as he extracted the documents. His eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the dense legal jargon with terrifying speed. I watched his jaw clench, a subtle tightening of muscle that sent a spike of pure dread straight into my chest. This is an emergency ex parte injunction, Mitchell stated, his voice devoid of emotion but loud enough to command the room. Signed by a probate judge at 8 o'clock this morning. It effectively freezes every single asset, trust, and holding tied to Winston's estate pending a full evidentiary hearing. Richard took a step forward, his chest inflating with a grotesque sense of victory. That is right, he sneered, savoring every single syllable. Every bank account, every stock portfolio, every piece of commercial real estate. Nothing moves, nothing gets sold, and most importantly, nothing goes to you. I looked at Mitchell, demanding an explanation with my eyes. How could a judge freeze an $80 million estate based on the word of biological parents who surrendered their rights 2 decades ago? Mitchell flipped to the second page, his brow furrowing deeply. They are contesting the original adoption, Mitchell explained quietly, though the dead silence in the room amplified his words. They are claiming a procedural defect in the out-of-state transfer. Richard could not contain his malicious delight. He barked a harsh, abrasive laugh, pointing a stained finger at the legal brief. Your billionaire savior was not as smart as he thought he was, Richard mocked. When he dragged you across state lines to finalize the adoption 20 years ago, his expensive lawyers and the social workers failed to file a specific waiver terminating our biological parental rights in our home state. It was a minor clerical error, a missing signature on a secondary form that got lost in the shuffle. But legally, it means the adoption is contestable. It means in the eyes of the law, we never officially stopped being your parents. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. They were not trying to undo the adoption out of some twisted sense of parental love or remorse. They were weaponizing a 20-year-old bureaucratic oversight to hijack the entire inheritance. By contesting the adoption, they were attempting to legally re-establish themselves as my rightful guardians and next of kin. If Winston's adoption was deemed invalid by a probate judge, his will leaving everything to his legally recognized daughter could be thrown into legal limbo. They were trying to position themselves to control the massive estate by controlling my legal status, essentially claiming that everything I owned actually belonged to them. This is a temporary freeze based on an unproven filing, Mitchell interjected, stepping firmly between me and my biological father. It buys you a preliminary hearing, Richard, nothing more. And this injunction applies strictly to financial assets, not physical premises. This memorial is a private event paid for by a private trust. You are trespassing. Mitchell snapped his fingers at the security guards who had been waiting for the command. Escort these individuals out immediately. If they resist, call the police and have them charged with criminal trespass. Richard scoffed, but the arrogant smirk remained plastered on his face. He knew when to retreat. He had dropped his bomb, and the damage was already done. We will see you in court, Sienna. Richard threatened, turning on his heel. Brenda shot me one last venomous glare, adjusting her cheap jacket before following her husband down the aisle. Cameron lingered for a fraction of a second, offering a pathetic mocking wave to the stunned crowd before chasing after his parents. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, leaving a suffocating heavy silence in their wake. The rest of the memorial service was an absolute blur. The heartfelt condolences from Winston's esteemed colleagues now felt tainted by the looming spectacle of a vicious legal battle. I shook hands, accepted sympathetic embraces, and maintained a flawless mask of stoic professionalism. I owed it to Winston to send him off with dignity regardless of the circus the Caldwells had just orchestrated. I refused to let anyone see me bleed. Once the final guest had departed and the chapel emptied, I walked back to the administrative offices to settle the interment fees. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Abernathy, offered his deep sympathies as he printed the final invoice. I thanked him, reaching into my designer purse. I pulled out my platinum credit card, an account directly tied to the primary estate trust Winston and I managed together. I handed it to Mr. Abernathy, craving nothing more than to go home, lock the doors, and finally allow myself to grieve in private. Mr. Abernathy swiped the card through his terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, unpleasant sound. He frowned, pressing a few buttons on the keypad. I am sorry, miss, he said gently. It seems this card has been declined. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. There must be a mistake. I insisted, pulling out a secondary corporate card. Try this one. He swiped the second card. The same harsh beep echoed in the small office. Declined. My heart began to race. I pulled out my personal debit card, the independent account where my own salary as an investment portfolio manager was deposited entirely separate from Winston's holdings. Swiped. Declined. The crushing realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The injunction had not just frozen Winston's corporate real estate holdings. Richard and his lawyers had filed the paperwork to aggressively freeze every single financial account associated with my name, tying my personal finances to the contested estate. They had cast a massive legal net over everything I touched. I stood there staring at the useless plastic in my trembling hands, realizing the absolute horror of my situation. The Caldwells had completely locked me out of my own life, stripping me of every resource before Winston was even buried. I stood in Mr. Abernathy's quiet carpeted office, the declined plastic card feeling like a lead weight in my palm. Mitchell, who had been waiting in the hallway, caught the look of absolute shock on my face and stepped into the room. With a swift, practiced motion, he pulled out his own firm's corporate card and handed it to the funeral director. He murmured a quiet assurance that his office would cover the interment expenses directly. I could not even utter a thank you. My mind was spinning, processing the terrifying velocity with which Richard Caldwell had struck. We walked out of the chapel and into the biting chill of the afternoon air. I had arrived in a chauffeured town car paid for by the estate. Now I climbed into the passenger seat of Mitchell's personal sedan. I was a portfolio manager overseeing billions in assets, yet I did not even have the funds to buy a cup of coffee. We drove in heavy silence to Mitchell's high-rise legal office in the financial district. The towering glass structure overlooked the sprawling city skyline, a skyline heavily dotted with commercial properties Winston had developed. We rode the private elevator up to the 42nd floor, bypassing the lavish reception area and heading straight into Mitchell's private conference room. The space was intimidating, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of my father's empire. But inside that room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Mitchell dropped his leather briefcase onto the long glass table and pulled out the thick manila envelope Richard had thrown onto the casket. He spread the documents out across the table, smoothing the crumpled edges. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the dense paragraphs of legal jargon that currently held my entire existence hostage. I stood by the window, wrapping my arms around myself, waiting for the verdict. Mitchell took a long, deep breath, running a hand through his graying hair. He looked exhausted, a rare sight for a man who thrived on high-stakes corporate warfare. They planned this with surgical precision. Mitchell began, his voice grim. The injunction was granted by a judge who is notoriously strict on procedural compliance. The clerical error Richard brought up is entirely legitimate. When Winston finalized your adoption 2 decades ago, the cross-state jurisdictional paperwork required a specific waiver of rights from your biological parents. Your birth state mandated a secondary hearing that simply slipped through the cracks. It was a bureaucratic oversight, a tiny missing link in a mountain of paperwork. But in the eyes of probate law, it is a fatal vulnerability. I turned away from the window, my analytical mind kicking into gear despite the panic attempting to drown me. A technicality, I stated, pacing the length of the conference table. A 20-year-old technicality cannot possibly invalidate a lifetime of legal guardianship. Winston raised me. My name is on the trusts. I am the sole named beneficiary in his will. Mitchell shook his head, his expression dead serious. You are looking at this logically, Sienna. You need to look at it maliciously. Richard does not have to invalidate the adoption today. He just has to cast enough doubt on it to freeze the assets. And he has hired the absolute worst people possible to do it. Mitchell tapped a heavy finger against the letterhead on the injunction. Sterling and Croft. They are a notoriously ruthless probate litigation firm. They do not practice law, they practice legal terrorism. I recognized the name from whispers in the financial sector. Sterling and Croft were the scavengers of the corporate world, the firm you hired when you wanted to destroy your opponent through endless, agonizing attrition. Mitchell confirmed my worst fears. They specialize in dragging wealthy estates through probate purgatory. They will file motion after motion, contest every single asset, and demand forensic accounting of 20-year-old records. They will depose everyone you know. The legal loophole they found is just wide enough to justify a full investigation into Winston's estate. If we fight this in probate court, they can drag this out for 5, maybe even 10 years. 10 years, I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. They want to hold my father's legacy hostage for a decade. And during that decade, Mitchell continued, his voice dropping an octave, the estate pays the legal fees. That is how the law works. The assets are frozen to you, But the costs of litigating the dispute are bled directly from the $80 million fortune. By the time this reaches a final judge, Sterling and Croft will have drained millions in billable hours. The estate will be bled completely dry. I stared at the paperwork, the sheer malicious brilliance of the Caldwell's plan settling over me. This was not a fight for custody. This was not a desperate family trying to reunite with their long-lost daughter. This was a calculated professional extortion scheme. They do not actually care about winning the case, I deduced aloud, my voice hardening as I applied my corporate training to the family dispute. They just want to cause so much financial damage and legal gridlock that I am forced to pay them off. Exactly, Mitchell confirmed, leaning back in his leather chair. They are professional extortionists. They froze your personal accounts to starve you out, to induce a panic. They want you terrified, broke, and desperate. Within a week, Sterling and Croft will reach out with a settlement offer. They will ask for $10 or maybe $15 million to sign the waiver and walk away quietly. It is a ransom demand. Mitchell let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the brutal reality to sink in. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a mix of sympathy and pragmatism. Sienna, I know how much this hurts. But from a purely financial standpoint, fighting them might cost you more than paying them. If you settle, the injunction is lifted, the accounts unfreeze, and you retain the bulk of Winston's empire. You need to seriously consider paying the ransom to save the estate and your own sanity. I looked down at the injunction, tracing the raised seal of the probate court with my fingertip. I thought about Brenda slapping me at the altar. I thought about Richard dropping these very papers onto the casket of the man who had actually loved me. I thought about being 9 years old, shivering in the rain, waiting for a mother and father who had deliberately driven away. Winston taught me how to identify toxic assets. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. He taught me how to dissect hostile takeovers and how to recognize a predator. But above all, he taught me never to negotiate with terrorists. Mitchell watched me, recognizing the shift in my demeanor. The shock was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Sienna, Mitchell warned gently, if you refuse to settle, this will be a bloodbath. They will drag your name through the mud. They will destroy your privacy. It will be a brutal legal war. I looked up, meeting his gaze with absolute resolve. Then let it be a war. They want to bleed the estate dry. They want to starve me out. They think because they threw me away, I am still that weak, helpless little girl crying at a gas station. But they did not factor in who raised me. I leaned over the table, my hands planted firmly on the glass. I will not give Richard and Brenda Caldwell a single solitary penny of my father's money. I do not care if it takes 10 years. I do not care if it takes every ounce of my energy. We are not settling, Mitchell. We are going to court, and we are going to tear them apart. The formal rejection of the settlement offer was transmitted to Sterling and Croft the very next morning. Mitchell drafted a concise, ironclad letter stating that the estate would not entertain any form of financial extortion and was fully prepared to litigate the matter to the fullest extent of the law. I knew the Caldwells would not simply walk away quietly after being denied their massive payday, but I severely underestimated the sheer viciousness of their contingency plan. Since I refused to pay them off in the shadows, they decided to destroy me in the glaring light of the public eye. The retaliation began exactly 3 days later. I was sitting in my office at the investment firm, reviewing market analytics on a secondary monitor, when my assistant rushed into the room. She did not knock. Her face was pale and she was clutching her tablet like a shield. She placed it silently on my desk and pressed play. It was a live broadcast of a popular local morning talk show. There, sitting on a plush pastel couch across from a sympathetic host, was Brenda. She had abandoned the cheap, flashy suit from the funeral. Instead, she wore a modest, oversized knit sweater designed to make her look fragile, small, and maternal. She clutched a tissue in her hands, her shoulders trembling, as she delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. "He stole my baby!" Brenda wept, looking directly into the camera lens with wide, tear-filled eyes. We were a struggling family. We hit a rough patch, a terrible financial crisis, and we just needed temporary help. But Winston did not want to help us. He saw a vulnerable little girl, and he used his billions to buy her. He kidnapped my daughter through a broken legal system. The host leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on Brenda's knee, eating up every single fabricated word. "And you tried to get her back," the host prompted softly. Brenda nodded, letting a single perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. Every single day. But he had a wall of expensive lawyers. He brainwashed her. He filled her head with lies about us and corrupted her with money. Now my beautiful girl is a cold, greedy woman. She is mentally unstable from the trauma of what that man did to her. We just want to bring her home and get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs, but she has turned her back on her real family to hoard the fortune he promised her. I stared at the screen, a chilling wave of nausea washing over me. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Brenda was entirely rewriting history. She had twisted the horrific reality of abandoning me at a gas station into a tragic tale of a desperate mother wronged by a predatory billionaire. She was painting Winston as a monster who bought a child, and she was branding me as a brainwashed, mentally unstable gold digger who cared more about commercial real estate than her own struggling blood relatives. The public backlash was instantaneous and brutal. In the age of viral outrage, a story about a wealthy, heartless heiress and a grieving, impoverished mother was irresistible bait. Within 2 hours, snippets of the interview were trending across every major social media platform. Comment sections were flooded with vitriol demanding that I surrender the estate to my biological family. The narrative caught fire completely out of my control. News outlets began running segments on the billionaire who bought a family, digging up Winston's old business rivals to provide quotes about his supposedly ruthless character. The fallout hit my professional life with the force of a freight train. I was an investment portfolio manager handling hundreds of millions of dollars for high net worth clients. My job required absolute public trust, impeccable judgment, and a spotless reputation. Brenda had just detonated a bomb that shattered all three. By noon, my office phone was ringing nonstop. Clients were demanding explanations. By 1 o'clock, an email arrived from the executive board. I was summoned to the main conference room immediately. I walked down the glass-walled corridor of my firm, acutely aware of the sudden silence that fell over the trading floor as I passed. Colleagues averted their eyes. The whispers stopped. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, I found the 3 senior partners sitting shoulder to shoulder at the head of the long oak table. A representative from Human Resources sat quietly in the corner, a stark indicator of how this meeting was going to end. Arthur, the managing partner who had mentored me for years, could not even meet my gaze. He stared down at a printed copy of a tabloid article featuring my face next to the word "heartless." "Sienna, please sit," Arthur said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. I remained standing, my posture rigid. "I know why I am here, Arthur. That interview was a complete fabrication. My biological parents are attempting to extort my father's estate, and this is their leverage. Mitchell is already preparing a defamation suit." "We manage wealth, Sienna." Arthur interrupted, his tone hard and uncompromising. "We do not manage tabloids. Our clients entrust us with their life savings because we project stability and discretion. Right now, your name is trending alongside accusations of mental instability, elder manipulation, and family fraud. 3 of our largest institutional clients called this morning, threatening to pull their portfolios if you remain the lead manager on their accounts." "I can manage the clients," I argued, my voice tight. "My returns over the last 4 quarters are the highest in the firm. The numbers speak for themselves." "The numbers do not matter when the optics are this toxic," another partner chimed in coldly. "We cannot have reporters camping in our lobby. We cannot have our brand associated with a highly publicized probate war. You are a liability right now." Arthur sighed, finally looking up at me with an expression of weary finality. "We are placing you on immediate administrative leave, Sienna, effective as of this moment. You are to hand over your keycard, your corporate phone, and your laptop to Human Resources." "Paid leave?" I asked, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I needed my salary. With Winston's estate frozen, my paycheck was the only financial lifeline I had left to pay Mitchell's retaining fees and keep a roof over my head. The Human Resources representative stood up, handing me a manila folder. "The firm policy dictates that leave pending an investigation into public misconduct is strictly unpaid. We will reevaluate your employment status once this personal legal matter is fully resolved." I took the folder, the rough paper scraping against my numb fingers. In one swift, devastating stroke, the Caldwells had stripped away my entire identity. They had frozen my father's legacy, smeared his memory, and completely obliterated the career I had spent 10 agonizing years building. I was suddenly jobless, incomeless, and publicly disgraced. I was escorted back to my office by a security guard, given exactly 10 minutes to pack my personal belongings into a cardboard box. I walked out of the towering glass building and stood on the bustling city sidewalk, the freezing rain beginning to fall against my face. I clutched the cardboard box to my chest, entirely locked out of the life I had known just 24 hours prior, realizing with absolute clarity that I was now fighting for my very survival. The freezing rain soaked through my wool coat before I even reached the subway station. I clutched the damp cardboard box to my chest, a pathetic physical manifestation of my entire professional career, and merged into the sea of commuters. Every glance sent a spike of paranoia through my veins. Did they see Brenda weeping on the morning broadcast? Did they recognize the heartless heiress from the viral clips? The commute was agonizing. My personal debit cards were frozen solid by Sterling and Croft, forcing me to scrounge for exact change at the bottom of my purse just to buy a train ticket. By the time I reached my neighborhood, my muscles ached with a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion. I turned the corner onto my quiet, tree-lined street, desperate for the safety of the brick townhouse I had purchased 3 years ago. It was a modest but elegant property, bought entirely with my own earned commission bonuses strictly separate from Winston's trust funds. It was my sanctuary. But as the familiar wrought iron gate came into view, my brief moment of relief shattered into a million jagged pieces. Smeared across the pristine white wood of my garage door in violent neon red spray paint was a single massive word: thief. The thick letters dripped down the wood, bleeding into the wet pavement below. My stomach plummeted. The Caldwells had not just frozen my assets and destroyed my career. Their fabricated media circus had officially breached the boundaries of my personal safety. The viral outrage had mobilized. Some unhinged viewer, enraged by Brenda's crocodile tears, had taken it upon themselves to deliver a message right to my doorstep. I dropped the cardboard box onto the wet concrete. The contents of my desk spilled onto the ground, but I did not care. A white-hot, blinding rage consumed the last of my despair. I refused to be a victim. I refused to let them brand my home with their fabricated lies. I marched up the front steps, unlocked my door, and threw my ruined coat onto the floor. I raided the utility closet under the stairs, grabbing a heavy bristle scrub brush, a bucket, and industrial-strength chemical solvent. I dragged the supplies back out into the freezing downpour. I attacked the garage door with manic intensity. The harsh chemicals burned my lungs, mixing with the icy rain that lashed at my face. I scrubbed the wood until my knuckles were raw and bleeding, scraping at the red paint with a desperate animalistic energy. The water pooling around my boots turned a sickening shade of pink, splashing up onto my slacks, but the paint had already set into the grain of the wood. The harsh red lines refused to fade, mocking my frantic efforts. I scrubbed harder, my breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. I was not scrubbing away spray paint. I was trying to scour away the toxic stain the Caldwells had left on my entire existence. The harsh glare of headlights suddenly cut through the gray afternoon gloom, momentarily blinding me. The low, heavy rumble of a high-performance engine vibrated through the wet pavement. I froze, my raw fingers gripping the handle of the scrub brush like a weapon. A sleek, black luxury SUV pulled smoothly into the driveway, stopping mere inches from the pooling red water at my feet. The engine cut off. The tinted windows hid the occupants, but I braced my stance, my adrenaline surging. If Richard or Cameron thought they could show up to gloat over their handiwork, they were about to face a very different version of the woman they had cornered in the chapel. The heavy passenger door swung open. A pair of impeccably polished designer stilettos stepped onto the wet concrete, entirely unbothered by the miserable weather. It was not Richard, it was not Cameron, and it certainly was not Brenda. Nia Caldwell stepped out of the vehicle. I recognized her instantly from the brief, extensive background checks Mitchell had run on the family network. She was Cameron's wife, an incredibly sharp, formidable corporate lawyer who operated out of a high-tier firm in Chicago. As a brilliant African-American woman navigating the ruthless upper echelons of corporate litigation, she possessed a reputation for being cold, precise, and utterly terrifying in a courtroom. Nia wore a tailored charcoal gray wool trench coat that cut a striking silhouette against the dreary backdrop of the storm. She held a sleek black umbrella over her head, shielding her flawless makeup and tightly coiled braids from the freezing rain. She carried herself with an aura of absolute authority, projecting a quiet power that immediately set her apart from the cheap, desperate hustle of her in-laws. I tightened my grip on the scrub brush, preparing for another calculated attack. If the Caldwells had dispatched their heavy legal hitter to serve me with more fraudulent paperwork, I was ready to throw the bucket of chemical solvent right across the hood of her pristine SUV. But Nia did not gloat. She did not sneer. She barely even glanced at the massive red graffiti defiling my property. Instead, she bypassed the hostility entirely. She closed the distance between us, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, completely unfazed by my defensive posture. She reached into the deep pocket of her designer coat and withdrew her hand. Nestled between her manicured fingers was a small silver USB drive. Nia held it out toward me. Her dark eyes were unreadable, calculating, and piercingly intelligent. She looked at me not as a sister-in-law, not as a target, but as an equal player on a chessboard that was rapidly catching fire. I did not move. I stared at the silver drive, rain dripping from my eyelashes, my mind racing through a dozen different traps this could represent. "Take it," Nia commanded, her voice smooth, low, and completely devoid of warmth. I slowly lowered the scrub brush, reaching out with a trembling, paint-stained hand to take the small metal device. The metal was cold against my palm. "They are lying to the world, and they are lying to you," Nia stated, her tone sharp and precise, slicing through the ambient noise of the storm. "I have the proof." The drive to the diner was silent, save for the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers against the relentless rain. I sat in the passenger seat of Nia's SUV, the silver USB drive, feeling unnaturally heavy in my coat pocket. My hands were still stained with the red paint I had failed to remove from my garage, a stark reminder of how quickly my life had dissolved into chaos. Nia maneuvered the vehicle through the city's labyrinthine streets with a cold, focused precision, eventually pulling into the gravel parking lot of a forgotten, dimly lit diner on the industrial outskirts. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, not to conduct high-stakes corporate espionage. We walked inside, the bell above the door chiming with a tinny, lonely sound. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning agents. Nia chose a booth in the far back corner, obscured by shadows. She didn't bother with menus. She simply slid into the vinyl seat and leaned across the table, her gaze pinning me in place. She looked every bit the shark I had heard about, but there was a flicker of something raw in her eyes, fear perhaps, or pure, unadulterated self-preservation. "You want to know why they are going after the estate?" Nia began, her voice cutting through the silence. "It isn't because they missed you. It isn't because they want to reclaim their lost daughter. It is because the Caldwell name is a sinking ship, and they are drowning." She pulled a notebook from her bag, not to show me, but to keep her own thoughts organized. "Richard isn't the successful developer he pretends to be. That facade of old money, it is debt, layer upon layer of leveraged loans, phantom assets, and creative accounting. He is completely bankrupt. His firm is currently under investigation by the IRS for massive tax evasion, and the federal audit started 2 weeks before Winston passed. They are circling the drain, Sienna. They didn't come to that chapel to reconnect. They came because they needed $80 million to pay off the feds and stay out of prison." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The image of Richard slamming those legal papers onto Winston's casket took on a new, more sinister meaning. It hadn't been a power play, it had been a desperate scramble for survival. "But it gets worse," Nia continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It's not just the old man. Cameron, my husband, the golden child, he has been living a double life. While he was playing the part of the devoted, well-to-do son, he was funneling family funds into underground poker rings. He owes $5 million to a syndicate that doesn't use bankruptcy courts to collect their debts. They use leverage, violence, and intimidation. They aren't just facing financial ruin, they are facing physical threats. They are scared for their lives, and they see your inheritance as the only way to satisfy the people who are coming for them." The revelation of Cameron's gambling debt filled in the final piece of the puzzle. I thought back to his flashy, desperate suit at the memorial service. It hadn't been a fashion choice. It was the attire of a man walking with a target on his back. They were being squeezed by the federal government on one side and an unforgiving criminal syndicate on the other. I looked at Naya, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the man she was married to. Why are you telling me this? You are married to Cameron. If they go down, doesn't that affect you? That is exactly why I am here. Nia said, her lips curling into a cynical, humorless smile. I am a lawyer, Sienna. I know when a case is unwinnable. I know when the evidence is stacked against you. I have spent the last 6 months documenting everything, not to save them, but to save myself and my children. Cameron thinks I don't know the extent of his debts, but I have been watching the money move. I have been watching the threats arrive. I have a life built on my own professional reputation. I am not going to let him drag me and my children into a grave with him. She pushed the silver USB drive across the laminate table, a small, unassuming piece of metal that contained the final nail in the Caldwell family's coffin. That drive contains the paper trail for Richard's illicit accounts and the records of Cameron's communication with the syndicate. It is enough to bury them. It is enough to ensure they never get near you or your estate ever again. I didn't reach for it yet. I wanted to be certain. And what do you get out of this alliance, Nia? Why shouldn't I just take this to Mitchell and let him burn you along with them? Because if you do that, we all lose, Nia said, her tone as clinical as a surgeon's. If the Caldwells are indicted on federal charges, everything goes into government receivership. The assets get locked up, the legal battles become national news, and you spend the next 10 years tied up in bankruptcy litigation that will bleed your father's estate dry. You don't want them punished, you want them neutralized. You want them to go away, to drop the lawsuit, and to vanish from your life. My evidence does that. It gives you the leverage to force them to sign a waiver and disappear. If you use it to destroy them, you destroy yourself in the process. I understood her angle. She wasn't asking for money, and she wasn't looking for love. She was looking for an exit strategy, and she had realized that I was her best hope of securing it. She needed me to succeed so that she could survive the fallout of her own marriage. I reached out and finally took the USB drive, sliding it into my purse. It felt like holding a live grenade. I need to talk to Mitchell, I said, my voice steady. He needs to verify that this isn't another trap. Nia nodded, unbothered by my skepticism. Verification is expected. I have provided the account numbers, the corresponding wire transfers, and the dates of communication with the syndicate's local handlers. You will find that everything is accurate. I am not interested in games, Sienna. I am interested in survival. My children deserve a future that isn't dictated by Cameron's catastrophic failures. As she spoke about her children, the cold corporate mask she wore slipped for just a second. I saw the genuine fear of a mother who had looked into the abyss of her husband's choices and decided she had to choose a different path. It was a mirror of my own reality reflected in the eyes of my enemy's wife. We left the diner in silence. The rain had intensified, turning the streets of the industrial district into a blurred, shimmering mess of neon and shadow. I didn't say goodbye to Nia. I didn't thank her. We were two predators sitting at the same table, brought together by the shared necessity of dismantling a common threat. She disappeared into the darkness of her SUV, the taillights fading into the gloom, leaving me alone with the weight of the drive in my pocket. I drove back toward my townhouse, my mind racing through the logistics of what Nia had given me. This was the turning point. I had been reeling from the injunction, the media circus, and the sudden loss of my career, feeling like I was losing control of every aspect of my life. But now I had the ammunition to fight back. I could see the path forward, a path that led through the courtrooms, the boardrooms, and the dangerous underbelly of the city. But it was a path I would walk with purpose. I would not pay their ransom. I would not be the victim they intended me to be. I was Winston's daughter, and I had learned how to turn the tables on anyone who dared to threaten what was mine. I locked the deadbolt of my townhouse and immediately bypassed the kitchen, ignoring my physical exhaustion and the lingering acrid smell of the chemical solvent on my hands. I moved straight to my home office, booting up my personal encrypted workstation. The silver USB drive clicked into the port, a tiny piece of hardware holding the potential destruction of my biological family. I spent the next 14 hours locked in that room, fueled entirely by black coffee and a cold, calculating resolve. My years managing hundreds of millions of dollars in investment portfolios had trained my brain to see the narratives hidden within complex spreadsheets, and the story Nia had handed me was a masterpiece of absolute financial ruin. The files were meticulously organized, a testament to Nia's formidable legal prowess. I dove into Richard's corporate ledgers first. On the surface, his real estate development firm projected a healthy, aggressive growth strategy. But once I applied standard forensic stress tests to the data, the illusion evaporated completely. He had been inflating asset valuations for nearly a decade, using phantom equity to secure massive high-interest loans from secondary lenders. He had created a tangled web of shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, bouncing the same borrowed capital between them to generate fake revenue streams. It was a classic Ponzi structure, and the foundation had completely rotted away. The federal audits Nia mentioned were clearly closing in on the discrepancies. The Internal Revenue Service was already tracking the offshore accounts he had desperately tried to bury in the Cayman Islands. Richard was looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison for tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Then I shifted my focus to Cameron. If Richard's crimes were a calculated, slow-moving disaster, Cameron's financial footprint was a violent, chaotic implosion. The gambling markers were staggering. He had not just been playing high-stakes poker. He had been leveraging his father's fraudulent company as collateral to borrow money from an underground syndicate that operated far outside the bounds of the law. I traced dozens of wire transfers to dummy corporations acting as fronts for illicit offshore casinos. The debt had snowballed from a few $100,000 to a crippling $5 million in less than a year. Attached to the financial records were copies of encrypted text messages Nia had managed to intercept. They were not polite collection notices. They were explicit, gruesome threats detailing exactly what would happen to Cameron if the syndicate did not receive their funds by the end of the month. I pushed my leather chair back from the desk, rubbing my burning eyes as the morning sun began to creep through the window blinds. The sheer scale of their desperation was breathtaking. They were entirely backed into a corner surrounded by federal agents and violent creditors. Their ruthless attack on my father's estate, the dramatic media campaign with Brenda weeping on television, the vandalization of my home, none of it was driven by familial entitlement or simple greed. It was a panicked fight for survival. They viewed Winston's billions as their only viable escape hatch. But extreme desperation made people sloppy, and it made them highly vulnerable to internal fractures. I stared at the blinking cursor on my monitor, a counter-strategy rapidly forming in my mind. Defeating them in probate court would take months, possibly years, while my own assets remained frozen and my professional reputation remained in tatters. I could not afford to play a defensive waiting game. I needed them to implode immediately. I needed them to withdraw their claims and publicly retract their statements before Mitchell even had to file a motion to dismiss. To achieve that, I had to shatter their united front. Richard and Brenda were relying on the media spectacle to force a quick, quiet settlement, but Cameron did not have the luxury of time. The syndicate would not wait for a prolonged legal battle to conclude. I pulled out a prepaid burner phone I had purchased months ago for secure client communications and dialed the unlisted number Nia had provided at the diner. She answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and guarded. "The data is verified," I stated flatly, skipping any pleasantries. "You were right. They are completely underwater." "I told you I do not play games," Nia replied, the faint sound of city traffic humming in the background. "Do you have a plan, or are we just going to watch them drag this out in court until the feds seize everything?" "We are not going to court," I told her, my voice hardening into steel. "Richard and Brenda think they have time to play the victim on morning television. Cameron knows he does not. I need you to exploit that difference. I need you to turn up the temperature on your husband." There was a brief pause on the line. Nia's breathing remained steady. "How exactly do you want me to do that?" "Make him panic," I instructed. "You share a home with him. You see the collection notices. You know when the burner phones ring. Start dropping hints that Richard's legal strategy is failing. Tell him you heard through your firm that my lawyers are petitioning the judge to freeze the estate in a trust that will take 5 years to untangle. Make him realize that Brenda's television tears are not going to generate a fast cash settlement. He needs to believe that the money is entirely out of reach and the syndicate is running out of patience." Nia let out a low, humorless chuckle. You want me to convince him that his father's grand master plan is a death sentence. You want him to break ranks. Exactly, I confirmed. Cameron is the weak link. He is terrified of the people he owes money to. If you push him hard enough, his self-preservation instincts will kick in. He will panic, he will turn on Richard, and he will look for a faster way out. When he reaches his breaking point, you make sure he knows I am the only person holding a lifeline. Consider it done, Nia said, her tone shifting into a sharp business-like cadence. Cameron is already cracking under the pressure. A gentle push in the wrong direction is all it will take to send him over the edge. I will make sure he understands that his parents are leading him straight into a wood chipper. The line went dead. I set the burner phone down on my desk, feeling a cold, unfamiliar sense of power coursing through my veins. The Caldwells had tried to destroy me in the glaring light of the public eye, relying on a fabricated narrative to force my hand. But wars were not won on daytime television. They were won in the shadows using leverage, fear, and the brutal truth of the numbers. I closed my laptop, the exhaustion finally catching up to me, but I did not sleep. I sat in the quiet of my home waiting for the first cracks to appear in the Caldwell family foundation. It took exactly 48 hours for Nia's psychological warfare to break her husband completely. The fracture appeared late Thursday evening in the form of a frantic, severely misspelled text message from an unknown number. It was Cameron. He begged for 5 minutes of my time, claiming it was a matter of imminent life and death. I did not reply immediately, letting him sweat while I dictated the terms of the meeting. I chose the subterranean parking garage beneath my former investment firm, a massive concrete cavern that was virtually deserted after midnight. It was a sterile, echo-heavy environment where I controlled the exits, the lighting, and most importantly, the acoustics. Before stepping out into the freezing night air, I meticulously prepared for the encounter. I taped a high-fidelity digital microphone directly to my ribcage, carefully threading the thin transmission wire beneath the fabric of my silk blouse. Mitchell had previously warned me about the complex legal hurdles regarding the admissibility of secret recordings. But in this specific state, a recorded confession of an active extortion conspiracy was more than enough leverage to force a total surrender. I pulled my wool coat tight against the chill and descended into the dimly lit garage, the steady, sharp clack of my heels echoing off the concrete pillars. The air smelled heavily of motor oil and damp concrete. He was waiting by my vehicle, pacing erratically between two structural columns. The slick, arrogant grifter who had sneered at me in the chapel was entirely gone. Cameron looked like a hunted animal. His expensive designer clothes were severely wrinkled and stained. His hair was matted with sweat despite the cold, and his bloodshot eyes darted frantically at every passing shadow. He was vibrating with a terrified kinetic energy. When he saw me approach, he practically lunged forward, his hands trembling violently in the harsh fluorescent light. "Sienna, thank God you came," he gasped, his voice cracking into a high pitch. He did not bother with threats, legal posturing, or the fake familial warmth his parents utilized. To my absolute disgust, he collapsed right onto the filthy concrete floor. He dropped heavily to his knees, reaching out to clutch desperately at the hem of my coat. "You have to help me. Please, big sister, you have to help me. They are going to kill me." I stepped back instantly, forcing him to let go of my coat. I looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "Get up, Cameron, you are embarrassing yourself." "I cannot get up," he sobbed, genuine tears streaming down his flushed face. "You do not understand the people I am dealing with. I owe them $5 million. Exactly $5 million. If I do not wire the funds by Monday morning, they know where Nia sleeps. They know where my children go to school. They sent me pictures of my own house today. Please, you have Winston's money. You have billions. You can advance me the $5 million right now. It is a drop in the bucket for you, but it will save my life." I crossed my arms, pressing my arm against my side, fully aware of the microphone resting against my skin. I needed him to articulate the entire scheme perfectly. "Why are you begging me for an advance?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured and projecting a cold skepticism. "Richard and Brenda assured the entire world that you are the rightful heirs. Just ask your father to front you the cash from his highly successful real estate development firm." Cameron let out a wet, hysterical laugh that echoed horribly in the empty garage. "My father is a total fraud. He does not have $5 million. He does not even have $500 in liquid cash. He is completely bankrupt. The federal government is going to lock him up for tax evasion. He is entirely broke, Sienna. If Richard is bankrupt, then why go through this elaborate legal circus? I pressed, stepping closer to ensure the microphone caught every single syllable of his panicked rambling. Why drag my father's estate into probate court? Why drag Brenda onto national television to cry about her kidnapped daughter if you do not actually care about reclaiming your family? Because it was the only way out. Cameron cried, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, rapid rush. It was all a complete scam. The whole thing. Dad found the loophole in the adoption paperwork 3 months ago when he was desperately looking for assets to leverage. He realized Winston never filed the final addendum with the state. He told Mom it was our golden ticket. We knew Winston had billions in the primary accounts. We knew if we filed the injunction and threatened to freeze the trust, you would panic and offer a massive cash settlement just to make us go away. So you admit it. I challenged, my voice, deadly, calm. Brenda's televised tears, the claims that you just wanted your sister back, the emotional trauma. It was a complete fabrication designed to steal my inheritance. Yes, Cameron wailed, slamming his palms flat against the cold concrete. We do not care about you. Mom does not care about you. They abandoned you because you were expensive and loud, and they only came back because they were about to lose their house and go to prison. Dad orchestrated the entire lawsuit purely to extort the estate. He promised me $10 million from the final settlement to pay off my markers. He said you would pay us anything just to avoid the media scandal. But Nia told me your lawyers are tying the money up in a blind trust for 5 years. I do not have 5 years. I do not even have 5 days. Please, Sienna, I am begging you. Advance me the money. Save my kids. I stared down at the pathetic broken man weeping at my feet. The confession was flawless. He had explicitly outlined the extortion plot, admitted his father's impending bankruptcy, confessed that the media campaign was a manufactured lie, and confirmed their malicious intent to raid Winston's estate. The Caldwells' entire aggressive legal strategy had just been completely dismantled by their own golden child. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the edge of the remote recording device to switch it off. I had exactly what I needed to destroy them. Your children will be fine, Cameron, I said, my voice dropping to a flat, merciless register. Nia is a very smart woman. She knows exactly how to protect them from the consequences of your profound stupidity. Cameron blinked up at me, his tear-streaked face contorting in sudden confusion. What are you talking about? Are you going to give me the money? I am not giving you a single dime, I replied, stepping neatly around his kneeling form and unlocking my car door. I do not negotiate with extortionists, and I certainly do not finance underground gambling syndicates. You wanted to play high-stakes games with Winston's legacy. Now you get to deal with the house calling in your debts. I slid into the driver's seat, ignoring his desperate, frantic screams as he scrambled to his feet and clawed at my window. I started the engine, the roar of the motor easily drowning out his pathetic pleas. As I drove up the concrete ramp and merged onto the dark city streets, I touched the microphone hidden beneath my blouse. The Caldwells had built an empire of fraud on a foundation of lies, and I was holding the match that would burn it entirely to the ground. It was barely past dawn when I pulled into the underground parking garage of Mitchell's towering downtown law firm. The adrenaline from my encounter with Cameron was still coursing through my system, effectively banishing any physical exhaustion. I had not slept a single minute, but I had never felt more awake. I carried the digital recording device in my coat pocket like a loaded weapon. Along with Nia's comprehensive financial files, I now possessed the definitive means to completely obliterate the Caldwell family and their fraudulent claims. I bypassed the receptionist, striding straight into Mitchell's corner office with a fierce sense of undeniable triumph. I was finally ready to end this extortion charade once and for all. Mitchell was already at his desk, flanked by towering stacks of legal briefs and half-empty coffee cups. He looked up, expecting my usual defensive posture, but I simply dropped the recording device onto his pristine glass desk. "It is over," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Cameron cracked. He explicitly detailed the entire extortion plot on tape. He admitted the adoption loophole was a calculated scam, he confessed to his father's impending federal indictment, and he acknowledged that Brenda's media tour was a manufactured lie designed solely to force a settlement. Play it, I expected Mitchell to smile, to lean back in his chair, and declare checkmate. Instead, his expression remained grim, the deep lines around his eyes tightening with profound tension. He did not even reach for the device. "That is phenomenal evidence, Sienna," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "And under normal circumstances, it would be the silver bullet we need to dismiss their claims entirely and press charges for extortion. But the circumstances just changed drastically." My triumphant smile vanished. The cold, familiar knot of dread returned to my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, lowering myself into the leather chair opposite him. Mitchell turned his computer monitor toward me. Displayed on the screen was a newly filed emergency court docket. Richard and his legal team bypassed the standard probate calendar early this morning. They are no longer just challenging the final addendum of your adoption. They filed an emergency petition to have you declared legally and mentally unfit to inherit or manage Winston's estate. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the maneuver. Mentally unfit. Based on what my professional portfolio is flawless. I manage hundreds of millions of dollars for institutional clients. They have absolutely zero grounds to question my cognitive stability. Mitchell sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. They are not attacking your current professional competence. They are attacking your foundational psychological history. Brenda submitted a thick file of sealed childhood psychiatric evaluations. Medical records she illegally retained from when you were 9 years old. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me as the horrifying reality set in. When Brenda and Richard had abandoned me at that gas station, the trauma had fundamentally shattered my reality. For the first 2 years after Winston formally took me in, I had suffered from severe night terrors, crippling anxiety, and profound depressive episodes. Winston had hired the best pediatric trauma specialists in the state to help me piece my mind back together. Those sessions were agonizing, deeply private, and fiercely protected. "How did she get those?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and violation. "Winston sealed everything. She is biologically still on your original medical charts," Mitchell explained grimly. "She likely requested copies before Winston finalized the initial adoption paperwork and kept them hidden for over 2 decades. She hoarded your childhood trauma like an insurance policy." In the petition, Richard's lawyers quote directly from the psychiatrist's notes, highlighting your severe attachment disorders and depressive episodes. They are arguing that the trauma of your early childhood left you with permanent, undiagnosed emotional instability, making you highly susceptible to manipulation and entirely incapable of managing a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. The sheer depravity of their strategy was breathtaking. Brenda was weaponizing the exact psychological damage she had personally inflicted upon me to steal my future. If the judge grants this emergency motion, Mitchell continued, delivering the final devastating blow, the court will appoint a temporary conservator to manage the estate until a thorough, independent psychological evaluation can be completed. And Richard Caldwell explicitly petitioned to be named that conservator, citing his status as your closest living biological relative. The room spun slightly. If Richard gained conservatorship even temporarily, it was game over. He would have unchecked access to Winston's primary accounts. He could instantly authorize the transfer of the $5 million to pay off Cameron's violent gambling syndicate, and he could funnel enough capital offshore to bury his impending federal tax evasion indictments. By the time I proved my mental competence and broke the conservatorship, the estate would be hopelessly plundered, and the Caldwells would be legally untouchable, hiding behind the protective shield of court-appointed asset management. The audio confession from Cameron would be dismissed as the manipulative coercion of a mentally unstable woman targeting her vulnerable brother. I looked down at the digital recorder resting on Mitchell's desk, and then at the screen displaying the monstrous petition. I had spent the last 2 weeks playing defense. I had reacted to their media smears, deflected their legal filings, and tried to protect Winston's legacy with dignity and restraint. I thought exposing their fraud would be enough to make them retreat into the shadows. I was wrong. The Caldwells were not rational adversaries looking for a quick payday. They were cornered predators willing to tear my sanity apart to save themselves from prison and underground syndicates. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me since the funeral vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. They wanted to drag my childhood trauma into a public courtroom. They wanted to brand me as unstable and broken just to gain access to the vault. I slowly reached out and picked up the recording device, my grip tight and unyielding. They want a war over my sanity, I said to Mitchell, my voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. Let them have it. But we are no longer playing defense. I do not just want to block this petition, Mitchell. I want to crush them. I want to use Cameron's confession and Nia's financial files to dismantle Richard's company, expose his federal crimes, and leave them with absolutely nothing. We are going to destroy them entirely. I left Mitchell staring at the stark reality of our new offensive strategy. The drive from the downtown law firm to Winston's primary estate was a blur of calculated, icy focus. The shock of Brenda weaponizing my childhood trauma had entirely burned away, leaving behind a pure, unadulterated rage. If they wanted to paint me as a broken, unstable victim of abandonment, I would show them exactly what kind of monster that abandonment had actually created. I bypassed the main living areas of the sprawling mansion and headed directly for the East Wing. Winston's private study had remained locked since the day of his massive stroke. Even the estate staff were forbidden from crossing the threshold. It was a fortress of dark mahogany and heavy velvet smelling faintly of pipe tobacco, aged leather, and old paper. I bolted the heavy oak doors behind me, sealing myself inside the only sanctuary that felt truly safe. My adoptive father was a brilliant strategist who trusted digital security about as far as he could throw a server rack. While he utilized state-of-the-art encryption for his active trading portfolios, his most sensitive high-level opposition research was strictly analog. He kept it buried in a series of wall safes hidden behind the custom-built shelving units. I engaged the biometric lock on the primary safe, my fingerprint overriding the dormant security protocols. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. Inside were dozens of thick leather-bound ledgers and expanding file folders. I pulled them out, stacking them across the massive expanse of his antique desk. I needed raw ammunition to counter Richard's conservatorship petition. I needed undeniable documented proof of their financial depravity that a judge could not ignore. I needed to shift into full predator mode, stripping away any lingering shred of familial empathy. As I started tearing through the physical files, carefully decoding Winston's shorthand notes, my secure burner phone vibrated against the desk. It was a heavily encrypted data packet from Nia. She had not just broken Cameron. She was now systematically dismantling her father-in-law's entire corporate facade from the inside out. The incoming files contained Richard Caldwell's master creditor lists. These were not the standard publicly filed bank loans he used to prop up his real estate development firm. These were the shadow ledgers. Nia had covertly funneled over a labyrinth of mezzanine lenders, predatory private equity firms, and offshore hard money lenders that Richard had desperately turned to when traditional banking institutions finally cut off his credit lines. The terms of these hidden loans were completely ruinous, featuring exorbitant interest rates and draconian default penalties. He had essentially mortgaged his own blood and future to keep up the appearance of staggering wealth. I printed every single page of Nia's data drop, laying the crisp, fresh sheets of paper out alongside the aged folders I had pulled from Winston's safe. I poured a glass of neat scotch, the amber liquid catching the light from the green glass desk lamp, and began to aggressively cross-reference the two distinct data sets. My eyes darted between Nia's freshly intercepted creditor list and a specific heavily tabbed ledger Winston had labeled under a completely innocuous alphanumeric code. At first, the connection was subtle. A corporate address matched here, a registered holding company aligned there. But as I traced the names of Richard's predatory lenders deeper into the corporate registry documents Winston had painstakingly compiled, a chilling, profound realization washed over me. The names matched perfectly. Not just one or two peripheral accounts, but almost all of his primary mezzanine debt holders. The anonymous shell companies bleeding Richard dry were quietly controlled by a series of complex blind trusts. And those blind trusts were directly funded and managed by Winston. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the breath catching in my throat, as the magnitude of the discovery hit me. Winston had not just been a passive observer of my biological family. He had been an apex predator patiently stalking his prey through the financial tall grass. For years, long before I ever took over his investment firm or learned the true nature of corporate warfare, my adoptive father had been methodically buying up Richard Caldwell's debt through anonymous proxy buyers. He had systematically cornered them, purchasing their promissory notes and tightening the financial noose millimeter by millimeter, without them ever realizing who held the leash. Winston had known with absolute terrifying certainty that Richard's boundless greed and fundamental incompetence would eventually drive the Caldwells to total financial ruin. And he knew that when that inevitable collapse happened, they would turn their sights on me, seeking to exploit the very daughter they had thrown away. He had not just secured my future through standard trusts and estate planning. He had meticulously laid a lethal, inescapable trap for the people who had discarded me at a dusty gas station. Winston was far more ruthless, far more calculating, and far more fiercely protective than I had ever fully comprehended. He had spent over a decade quietly financing their ultimate destruction, hoarding their debt, and waiting for the exact moment they dared to make a move on his daughter. They had not just stepped into a complicated legal battle over probate law. They had walked completely blind into an execution chamber that had been built exclusively for them. The conservatorship petition was meaningless now. I owned them completely. I owned them completely. The physical weight of the ledgers in my hands felt different now, transforming from a mere collection of historical financial records into a loaded weapon primed for immediate detonation. I leaned closer to the desk, the soft glow of the green glass lamp illuminating the intricate architecture of my adoptive father's genius. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of the trap Winston had built. As I traced the alphanumeric codes across the heavily encrypted pages, a clear, devastating pattern emerged from the chaos. Winston had not just used proxy buyers randomly, he had constructed a meticulously layered labyrinth of shell companies, all registered in jurisdictions with notoriously opaque corporate privacy laws. Delaware, Nevada, the Isle of Man, the Cayman Islands. He had buried his tracks under mountains of legal red tape. But all those disparate threads, all those dummy corporations holding the Caldwells' ruinous debt, eventually converged and fed back into one massive central entity. The name was stamped in bold, unassuming black ink across the master ledger: Horizon Holdings. I spread Richard's commercial loan agreements across the antique wood, placing them side by side with the Horizon Holdings asset portfolios. It was a masterpiece of aggressive, hostile financial acquisition. Every single time Richard's real estate development firm faced a severe liquidity crisis and turned to the shadow banking sector for a desperate lifeline, Horizon Holdings was waiting. Operating through various disguised subsidiaries, Winston's shell company acted as the ultimate financial backer. Richard firmly believed he was borrowing tens of millions of dollars from ruthless private equity firms and faceless mezzanine lenders who did not care about his family name. In reality, he was borrowing directly from the man who had adopted the daughter he threw away. Winston had effectively purchased Richard's entire corporate infrastructure for pennies on the dollar by systematically hoarding his toxic liabilities. The default clauses were draconian, designed to ensure that the moment a single payment was missed, the creditor could legally seize all underlying assets without a protracted court battle. But Winston had not stopped at Richard. My breathing grew shallow as I turned to the files detailing Cameron's staggering gambling debts. I had assumed Cameron was simply in bed with a violent underground syndicate entirely disconnected from his father's white-collar fraud. I was wrong. The paper trail here was considerably darker, buried under layers of offshore casino holding companies and anonymous wire transfers. But the ultimate destination was identical. The violent syndicate holding Cameron's $5 million in markers was heavily financed by a silent majority equity partner. That partner was Horizon Holdings. Winston had purchased his own biological son's illicit debts, wrapping the financial noose around Cameron's neck just as tightly as he had Richard's. Those threatening text messages, Cameron received the photos of his house, the terrifying pressure that had driven him to his knees in the parking garage just hours ago. All of it was indirectly funded by the very estate he was currently trying to extort. I stood up, pushing the heavy leather chair away from the desk. I paced the length of the silent, shadowed study, my heart hammering against my ribs as the sheer, brutal poetry of Winston's design washed over me. The Caldwells were desperate. They were bleeding cash, surrounded by federal audits and violent creditors cornered by forces they believed were completely outside their control. They had orchestrated this entire probate lawsuit, the media circus, the fake tears on daytime television, and the grotesque invasive conservatorship petition because they viewed Winston's estate as their only viable salvation. They thought stealing my inheritance was the key to paying off their debts. They had absolutely no idea that Winston's estate was the very entity that owned those debts. They were actively trying to rob their own primary creditor. The legal implications were staggering. If Richard somehow succeeded in his emergency petition to become the conservator of my estate, he would technically be seizing control of Horizon Holdings. He would be taking over the company that held the mortgages on his own fraudulent life. But he would never get the chance to realize that irony. As the sole executor and beneficiary of Winston's estate, I controlled Horizon Holdings right now. I possessed the unilateral legal authority to instantly recall every single commercial loan, accelerate every payment schedule, and trigger immediate catastrophic default clauses across the board. I did not need to fight a prolonged defensive battle in probate court over my mental fitness. I did not need to justify my childhood trauma to a judge or endure Brenda weaponizing my past against me in a public forum. The Caldwells had built their entire offensive strategy on the assumption that I was a passive target, a wealthy heiress who could be bullied into a quiet settlement to avoid embarrassment. They fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. They were treating this like a family dispute, but Winston had equipped me to fight a corporate war. I walked back to the desk and began organizing the documents, separating the Horizon Holdings master ledgers from the rest of the files. I placed them in a secure leather briefcase, my movements precise and deliberate. The fear and panic that had threatened to consume me at Mitchell's office were entirely eradicated. Winston had spent a decade quietly sharpening the blade, and now he had placed it directly into my hands. The Caldwells wanted to declare me mentally unfit to manage their salvation. Instead, they were about to discover that I was perfectly fit to manage their absolute destruction. I grabbed my burner phone and dialed Mitchell's direct line, knowing he would still be awake, frantically trying to prepare a defense against the conservatorship motion. I was about to tell him to drop the defense entirely. We were going on the attack. When Mitchell answered, his voice was tight with exhaustion, rattling off a rapid list of psychiatric expert witnesses we could call to counter the emergency conservatorship motion. I cut him off immediately. I instructed him to completely abandon the defensive strategy, drop the witness list, and draft a very specific ironclad settlement agreement, transferring full, irrevocable ownership of a single corporate entity. I gave him the name of the shell company, ignored his bewildered, frantic protests about giving up ground, and hung up the phone. The legal trap was set perfectly disguised as a white flag of surrender. Now I needed to bait the hook. I sat in the dim, heavy silence of Winston's study, staring at the contact card for Richard Caldwell on my primary phone. To sell this properly, to make a desperate, cornered narcissist believe he had genuinely won, I needed to tap into the very trauma Brenda had tried to weaponize against me. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow, rapid, and uneven. I reached deep into the darkest corners of my memory, dragging up the cold, dusty air of that gas station 20 years ago, letting the phantom sting of pure, unadulterated abandonment prick my eyes until genuine tears pooled on my lashes. I roughened my throat with a harsh, dry cough, physically forcing my body into a state of visible distress. By the time I hit the call button, my hands were deliberately trembling and my voice was a fragile, fractured whisper. Richard answered on the second ring. His tone was dripping with the smug, unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just delivered a fatal, inescapable blow. He greeted me using a sickeningly sweet, faux paternal register, clearly expecting my lawyers to be the ones calling to beg for a temporary truce. I did not give him the satisfaction of a negotiation. I went straight into a full, spectacular, and utterly fabricated psychological collapse. I let out a jagged, hyperventilating sob, the sound echoing miserably in the quiet study. "You win, Richard," I choked out, allowing a note of absolute terrified desperation to crack my voice. Please, just make it stop. Make all of it stop. There was a sharp, distinct intake of breath on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a predator scenting blood in the water. He tried to sound magnanimous, asking what exactly I meant, but the greedy, feverish anticipation was impossible to mask. I laid the performance on thicker, leaning heavily into the mentally unstable narrative he had just filed with the probate court. I told him I could not sleep, that the media smear campaign was tearing my mind apart, and that reading the childhood psychiatric evaluations they had leaked was breaking me all over again. I played the role of the fragile, broken little girl they had discarded to absolute perfection. I wept into the receiver, begging him to call off the lawyers, to stop the public humiliation, to drop the conservatorship motion, and to just leave me in peace. I cannot handle a prolonged court battle, I stammered, pausing to pull in a ragged theatrical breath that sounded like sheer panic. I am losing my mind, Richard. If you drop the conservatorship petition and withdraw all of your claims against the primary estate, I will give you a quiet, immediate settlement. You can have Horizon Holdings. I let the name hang in the air for a fraction of a second before rushing into the fabricated pitch, ensuring he did not have time to think critically. I falsely described Horizon Holdings as Winston's premier off-the-books real estate holding firm. I told him it was a massive, untangled asset pool, completely insulated from the rest of the probate mess, holding exactly $20 million in clean liquid capital and prime commercial properties. It was exactly the kind of untraceable high-value asset a man secretly facing federal tax evasion charges and crippling offshore debt would kill to possess. 20 million, Richard, I cried, letting a pathetic broken note of total surrender wash over the words. It is fully operational, completely liquid, and I will have Mitchell transfer total irrevocable ownership to you by tomorrow afternoon. Just take it and leave me alone, please. I cannot fight you and Brenda anymore. My mind cannot take it. I just want to be left alone. The silence on the line was deafening. I could practically hear the desperate, greedy calculations firing rapidly in his brain. He was drowning in toxic debt, staring down the barrel of federal prison, and his son owed a violent syndicate $5 million by Monday. I had just offered him a $20 million life raft with zero public scrutiny. A smart, cautious businessman would have instantly demanded a full audit of the holding company. A rational adversary would have requested a week to review the corporate asset ledgers with their forensic accountants before signing anything. But Richard Caldwell was not smart, and he was certainly not rational. He was a desperate, arrogant grifter who fundamentally believed I was a weak, emotionally unstable victim crumbling under his brilliant legal pressure. His monumental ego blinded him entirely to the possibility that he was being played. He took the bait with breathtaking, almost comical eagerness. His voice shifted instantly from faux paternal concern to brutally transactional greed. He agreed to the terms on the spot, dictating that the corporate transfer must be absolute, final, and irrevocable, ironically securing his own doom with his own aggressive demands. He promised to legally withdraw the probate suit and the emergency conservatorship motion the very second the ink dried on the Horizon Holdings transfer documents. He could barely contain the triumphant, arrogant gloating in his voice as he told me it was the right decision for my mental health, praising me for finally seeing reason and giving the family what they were owed. When the call finally disconnected, I slowly lowered the phone to the surface of the antique mahogany desk. I calmly reached up and wiped the fake tears from my cheeks, the fragile, terrified persona vanishing instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory calm. The study was silent again, but the air felt heavily charged electric with the proximity of absolute victory. Richard thought he had just successfully extorted $20 million from a broken, traumatized girl. In reality, he had just eagerly demanded the keys to his own execution chamber. I stood up, smoothing the front of my wool jacket. The bait had been swallowed whole right down to the wire. Now all that remained was to set the hook, reel them in, and watch them drown in their own devastating greed. The transition from apex predator to helpless prey requires a mastery of illusion. Less than 24 hours after my calculated phone call, I sat at the far end of the sterile, glass-walled boardroom in Mitchell's downtown law firm. The space was designed to intimidate, featuring an expansive mahogany table flanked by structural steel beams and panoramic views of the city skyline. Today, however, I needed it to feel like an execution chamber where I was the one walking to the block. I wore a plain, oversized gray sweater that made me look physically diminished, deliberately skipping my usual makeup to allow the pale exhaustion of the past few weeks to shine through. My hands rested on the polished wood, wrapped tightly around a shredded tissue. Mitchell sat beside me, his jaw set in a rigid line, perfectly playing the role of a deeply frustrated attorney, watching his client make a catastrophic, emotionally driven mistake. The heavy glass door swung open and the Caldwells marched in. They did not just enter the room, they occupied it with the swagger of conquering royalty. Richard led the procession, his chest puffed out beneath a sharp, overly tailored navy suit. He radiated a smug, unearned triumph, his eyes immediately locking onto my hunched posture with predatory delight. Brenda followed close behind, dripping in heavy gold jewelry and an aggressive floral perfume that instantly overwhelmed the room's climate control. She clutched a designer handbag, like a trophy, already mentally spending the $20 million she believed they had just extorted. Cameron trailed them, his face pale and shining with a thin sheen of nervous sweat, but his shoulders were visibly relaxed. He believed his violent gambling debts were hours away from being erased. Beside him walked Nia. She kept her head slightly bowed, her hand resting gently on Cameron's arm, projecting the exact image of a meek, supportive wife standing faithfully by her troubled husband. For a fraction of a second, her dark eyes flicked up to meet mine. There was no warmth, no outward sign of our alliance, just a cold, shared understanding of the trap that lay waiting on the mahogany table. She immediately dropped her gaze, perfectly maintaining her cover. Rounding out their raiding party was their attorney, a slick, excessively manicured man named Vance, who carried a bulging leather briefcase. He slapped it onto the table with a loud, obnoxious thud, foregoing any standard legal pleasantries. He clearly believed he had just outmaneuvered Mitchell, entirely blinded by his client's greed and the sheer magnitude of the purported asset transfer. "We are not here to waste time," Vance announced, pulling out his chair and gesturing for the Caldwells to sit. "My clients have graciously agreed to your terms, Sienna. Total irrevocable transfer of Horizon Holdings and its subsidiary assets to Richard Caldwell in exchange for the immediate withdrawal of the probate challenge and the emergency conservatorship petition." Mitchell let out a harsh, theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples. "I must go on record one final time, Sienna," he said, his voice laced with heavy, believable defeat. "I strongly advise against this course of action. Yielding an asset pool of this magnitude without a fight sets a dangerous precedent." I shrank further into my oversized sweater, letting my shoulders tremble. I lifted the crumpled tissue to my face, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "Just do it, Mitchell," I whispered, allowing my voice to crack perfectly on the final syllable. "I just want them gone. I cannot take another day of this." Richard leaned heavily across the polished wood, bracing his weight on his knuckles. He could not resist the urge to twist the knife, desperate to savor his perceived victory over the girl he had thrown away. "You finally made a smart business decision, Sienna," he sneered, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "I told you that you did not have the stomach for this kind of war. Your psychiatric records proved it. You were always too fragile, too damaged to handle real pressure. It is a miracle Winston trusted you with anything at all." Brenda smiled, a thin, venomous expression that disguised itself as pity. "We always knew you were weak," she chimed in, adjusting her gold bracelets. "It is frankly exhausting having to manage your emotional breakdowns. We are taking a massive burden off your shoulders today." I kept my head bowed silently, absorbing the verbal assault. Inside my pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of pure ice. Their cruelty was the final, undeniable seal on their fate. Every vicious word they spoke only justified the absolute financial annihilation I was about to unleash. "I used to feel a tiny twinge of guilt about leaving you at that gas pump in the middle of nowhere." Richard continued, his tone dripping with absolute malice. He wanted to break me down to the studs, completely cementing his total lack of remorse. "But looking at you now, trembling in your chair and handing over a $20 million empire because you are too scared to face a judge, I would leave you there 100 times over. You were never family, Sienna. You were just a bad investment that took 20 years to mature." So thank you for crying. Your little trauma paid off quite nicely for the people who actually matter. I let a single pathetic tear slide down my cheek, dabbing it away with a tissue. I let out a jagged, hyperventilating breath, portraying a woman fundamentally shattered by her abuser's words. I looked up at Mitchell, giving him a slow, defeated nod. Mitchell slid the thick stack of settlement papers toward me. The contract was bulletproof, drafted with exact legal precision to ensure the transfer of Horizon Holdings was absolute and could never be reversed by a court of law. I picked up my pen and signed my name with a deliberately shaky hand, marking the pages with the blue ink of my surrender. When I finished, I placed the pen down and silently pushed the heavy manila folder across the pristine glass and wood surface toward Richard. He snatched it up immediately, his eyes burning with feverish greed. Vance leaned over his shoulder, confirming the signatures and the withdrawal clauses. Richard pulled a heavy gold pen from his jacket pocket and signed his name with a harsh, triumphant flourish, legally binding himself to the shell company that held the mortgages on his own fraudulent life. He handed the contract to Vance, who smiled smugly at Mitchell. Brenda clapped her hands together in a soft, mocking rhythm. Cameron exhaled a loud, shaky breath of pure relief, believing he had just escaped a violent syndicate. Naya stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask. I stared at the signed contract resting in Vance's hands. They thought they had just conquered Winston's empire and secured their lavish future. They had absolutely no idea they had just signed their own financial death warrant. I kept my head down, clutching my tissue, letting them enjoy their glorious, fleeting illusion of victory. Vance held the heavy manila folder, his manicured fingers resting firmly on the thick stack of settlement papers. Richard had already reached into his tailored jacket for his gold pen, eager to finalize his perceived victory, but Vance placed a flat palm directly over the signature line before the ink could touch the paper. "Hold on, Richard," Vance cautioned, pulling the contract toward his side of the glass table. "Let me review the exact verbiage of the exchange before we finalize anything." Vance adjusted his expensive silk tie and began scanning the dense legal jargon Mitchell had meticulously drafted. He read the primary clauses aloud, his voice bouncing off the cold, sterile glass walls of the boardroom. The contract was explicitly clear. It detailed the absolute irrevocable transfer of Horizon Holdings and every single subsidiary asset contained within its corporate structure to Richard Caldwell. In direct exchange, Richard and Brenda were required to sign a permanent ironclad waiver. This waiver legally renounced any and all current or future claims against Winston's primary estate. Furthermore, it dictated the immediate and permanent withdrawal of the emergency conservatorship petition regarding my mental fitness. "The surrender terms are sound," Vance murmured, his eyes darting across the pages. "She is giving up the holding company completely, and in return, you drop the probate suit and the guardianship bid. It is a clean break." Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Exactly. She knows she is beaten. Just let me sign the contract, Vance, so we can get out of here." "Not yet," Vance replied, his tone suddenly dropping an octave. The slick lawyer flipped to the back of the contract, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He flipped back to the front, scanning the appendices. A cold knot of genuine fear began to form in my stomach. I kept my head down, hiding my eyes behind the shredded tissue, but my senses were entirely dialed in on Vance's shifting demeanor. Vance looked up, locking his gaze onto Mitchell. "Where is the schedule of assets?" he demanded. "Where are the audited financials, the tax returns, and the property deeds for Horizon Holdings?" Mitchell maintained his perfect poker face, crossing his arms over his chest. "As my client has made abundantly clear, she is suffering from severe mental exhaustion. This is an expedited settlement designed for immediate closure. You are getting a $20 million asset pool in exchange for dropping a baseless harassment campaign. The corporate entity is transferred as is." Vance let out a sharp, condescending bark of laughter. He pushed the contract back toward the center of the table and leaned in, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. "I do not care how exhausted your client claims to be. Nobody hands over a $20 million corporation without a standard due diligence period. I am not letting my client sign away his leverage in probate court for a blind box." Richard scowled, clearly annoyed by the delay. Vance, she is handing us the keys. Just verify the account balances and let us close. I cannot verify the balances because there are no disclosures attached to this agreement, Richard Vance snapped, turning to face his client. I need to put my forensic accountants on Horizon Holdings. We need to verify the liquidity she is claiming. We need to check for hidden liabilities pending litigation or outstanding tax liens attached to the shell company. Standard corporate acquisition protocol dictates a minimum 14-day due diligence period before any signatures are legally binding. The words hit me like a physical blow. 14 days. The terrifying reality of Vance's demand echoed in my mind, threatening to obliterate my entire strategy. If I allowed Vance and his forensic accountants even 24 hours to audit the ledgers of Horizon Holdings, the trap would instantly spring back on me. They would tear through the corporate veil Winston had constructed. They would trace the dummy corporations back to the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man, and they would make a horrifying, undeniable discovery. They would see that Horizon Holdings did not contain $20 million in clean liquid capital or prime commercial real estate. They would see that it held Richard Caldwell's toxic mezzanine debt. They would uncover the shadow ledgers detailing his ruinous loans with predatory private equity firms. They would find the offshore holding companies clutching Cameron's violent $5 million gambling markers. They would realize that Winston's estate was their primary creditor, holding the legal power to instantly seize every remaining asset they possessed. If Vance conducted that audit, my leverage would vanish. The Caldwells would immediately realize I was not a broken, terrified victim surrendering under pressure. They would know I was actively orchestrating their financial execution. Richard would sprint straight to the probate judge with undeniable proof of my deception, using my attempted trap as definitive evidence of my manipulative, unstable nature. The conservatorship motion would be granted instantly, handing Richard unchecked access to Winston's vault, while I was locked out of my own life. I clutched the damp tissue in my hands, fighting to keep my breathing shallow and erratic. I had to maintain the facade of a woman pushed to the absolute brink of a nervous breakdown, even as my mind raced to find a solution. I could not allow that 14-day window. I could not allow a 14-minute window. The settlement had to be signed today in this room before anyone looked under the hood of Horizon Holdings. Brenda shifted in her seat, her heavy gold bracelets clinking loudly against the glass table. She looked from Vance to Richard, her greed warring with the lawyer's caution. 14 days seems excessive, Vance. She is clearly falling apart right in front of us. We have her cornered. Why give her 2 weeks to change her mind or hide the money? Vance shook his head emphatically. Because blind acquisitions are how wealthy people end up bankrupt, Brenda. It is a basic legal safeguard. We audit the firm, confirm the $20 million is sitting exactly where she says it is, and then Richard signs the waiver. Cameron wiped the sweat from his upper lip, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He did not have 14 days. His syndicate deadlines were looming, and the violent threats were escalating daily. Dad Cameron urged, his voice tight, with barely concealed panic. We should just take the deal. It is a massive payout. If we wait, she might pull the offer entirely. I kept my face buried in my hands, listening to the fractured dynamics of their greed. My trap was perfectly constructed, but it required Richard to act on blind, arrogant impulse. Vance was the unexpected variable, the voice of reason trying to pull his client back from the edge of the cliff. The entire room hung suspended in a terrifying deadlock. My plan to dismantle the Caldwells from the inside out was teetering on the edge of total failure, entirely dependent on whether Richard's desperate greed could override his attorney's basic common sense. The stalemate in the room felt physical, a heavy, suffocating pressure pressing against the glass walls. Vance's manicured hand remained plastered over the signature line, a physical barrier between Richard and the $20 million he so desperately craved. Mitchell played his part with flawless execution, aggressively snapping his briefcase shut and letting out a sharp, dismissive scoff, fully prepared to walk away from the table. I kept my chin tucked against my chest, my shoulders shaking beneath the heavy wool of my oversized sweater. The silence stretched tight and brittle, waiting to snap. I knew that if I allowed Vance to dictate the pace of this negotiation, the Caldwells would leave this room, the forensic accountants would be deployed, and my entire carefully constructed web would be torn to shreds. It was time to introduce the catalyst. It was time to light the fuse. I slowly raised my head, letting out a fractured, wet gasp. I reached into the deep pocket of my sweater with trembling fingers and pulled out my smartphone. With a few quick, deliberate taps, I opened the custom application Nia had built for me just hours prior. The screen went completely black, save for a stark, glowing red digital timer in the center. The numbers were large and aggressive, silently ticking down the hours, minutes, and seconds. 3 hours, 42 minutes, and 16 seconds. 15 seconds. 14 seconds. I placed the phone flat on the polished mahogany and pushed it hard. It glided across the smooth surface with a soft hiss, coming to a sudden stop exactly an inch from Richard's clenched fists. Richard stared down at the glowing red digits, his brow furrowing in deep, sudden confusion. Vance leaned in, his eyes narrowing at the device. I pulled another shredded tissue to my face, letting out a pathetic, desperate sob. "You do not have 14 days, Vance." I choked out, my voice trembling with perfectly manufactured panic. "You do not even have 4 hours. If you do not sign that contract and execute the transfer immediately, the money is gone. All of it." Vance scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. A fabricated countdown timer on a smartphone. "Please, Sienna. We are not amateurs. You cannot manufacture a false deadline to bypass standard corporate due diligence. It is a pathetic negotiation tactic." I did not look at the lawyer. I kept my tear-filled eyes locked dead on Richard, watching the greed in his pupils war with his rising anxiety. "It is not a negotiation tactic," Richard V. whispered, letting the terror bleed fully into my tone. "It is a dead man's switch. Horizon Holdings is not just a standard shell company." Winston was paranoid. He wrapped the entire corporate entity in a strict, irrevocable charitable trust trigger. It was designed as a poison pill to protect his off-the-books assets from hostile probate takeover. I paused, drawing in a jagged, hyperventilating breath, ensuring the entire room was hanging on to my every word. The trigger was tripped the exact second Vance filed that emergency conservatorship motion against me this morning. I continued, my voice cracking under the weight of the lie. "The corporate bylaws have already initiated the liquidation protocol. If a legal transfer of ownership to a named beneficiary is not logged into the central holding registry by exactly 5 p.m. today, the trust automatically dissolves. Every single asset, the liquid capital, the commercial deeds, all $20 million, will be instantly and permanently dispersed to a pre-selected network of international wildlife charities. You get nothing. I get nothing. It all just vanishes." The atmosphere in this boardroom instantly fractured. Vance slammed his hand on the table, his face flushing red. "That is legally impossible," he shouted. "A charitable poison pill of that magnitude would require highly specific registered trust charters. You are lying." Mitchell immediately stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He reached into his briefcase and slammed a massive, heavily redacted stack of legal documents onto the glass directly in front of Vance. "Read the charter yourself, Vance," Mitchell snarled, his voice vibrating with genuine-sounding fury. "Section 4, Paragraph 9. The liquidation protocol is absolute. My client is explicitly violating my legal counsel by even offering you this lifeline. If you want to play games and audit the books for 2 weeks, be my guest. But at 5:01 p.m., you will be holding the deed to an empty shell, and the probate judge will laugh you out of court." Total chaos erupted on the Caldwell side of the table. Brenda let out a high-pitched, horrified shriek, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her face. "Wildlife charities." She screeched, the heavy gold bracelets clattering loudly. "Richard, they are going to give $20 million to animals. Do not just sit there, do something." Cameron completely lost whatever fragile composure he had left. The color drained entirely from his face, his eyes locking onto the glowing red numbers on the phone screen with sheer, unadulterated terror. He saw his violent syndicate debts, his shattered kneecaps, his absolute ruin staring back at him. He lunged across the mahogany table, grabbing his father's tailored sleeve. "Dad, sign it!" Cameron begged, his voice cracking in a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "We cannot lose this. You heard the lawyer, sign the damn paper before the clock runs out." Nia remained perfectly still, her eyes downcast, a masterclass in silent observation. Vance desperately grabbed Richard's other arm, physically trying to pull him back from the documents. "Richard, do not listen to them. It is a high-pressure trap, I cannot verify a single asset in this portfolio. You cannot blindly assume full liability for a corporation you have not audited. If you sign this, you waive all rights to Winston's estate." But Richard Caldwell was no longer listening to reason. He was a man drowning in a sea of hidden bankruptcies, federal tax evasion charges, and crushing offshore debt. The glowing red numbers on my phone were ticking away the only life raft he had ever been offered. His monumental ego and his desperate, ravenous greed completely short-circuited his brain. He violently shoved Vance away, his face twisted into an ugly, furious mask of pure avarice. "Shut your mouth, Vance!" Richard roared, his voice echoing brutally through the boardroom. "I am not losing $20 million because you want to play forensic accountant." With a harsh, guttural exhale, Richard ripped the settlement contract out from under Vance's protective hand. He snatched his gold pen from the glass surface, his hand shaking with adrenaline and greed, and aggressively slashed his signature across the final line. He pressed down so hard the nib nearly tore straight through the thick parchment. He shoved the finalized contract back across the table toward Mitchell, his chest heaving. "The deal is done," Richard snarled, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire. "The assets are mine." I kept my face buried in the tissue, my shoulders violently trembling. Outwardly, I was the picture of a broken, defeated girl weeping over the loss of her empire. Inwardly, my blood ran cold with absolute predatory victory. The ticking clock had done its job. The illusion was complete. Richard Caldwell had just bypassed every single legal safeguard designed to protect him, blinding himself to the reality of his actions. He had not just secured an empire. He had eagerly, frantically chained himself to the anchor that would drag his entire family to the bottom of the ocean. Mitchell caught the sliding folder with a practiced hand. He did not look at me. He simply gestured to the quiet, unassuming woman sitting in the far corner of the boardroom, the firm's senior notary public. She stepped forward, her flat, sensible shoes making no sound against the thick carpet. She placed her official ledger on the glass surface alongside her heavy brass embosser. Richard watched her with feverish impatience, his fingers drumming a frantic, greedy rhythm against his knee. He could not tolerate even a 30-second delay. He reached out and snatched the corporate seal of Horizon Holdings from Mitchell's side of the table, not waiting for the formalities or asking for permission. He pressed the heavy metal stamp onto the signature page himself, throwing his entire body weight into the motion. The crisp, raised ridge of the corporate emblem appeared on the thick parchment, an undeniable physical manifestation of his blind hubris. The notary methodically checked his driver's license, verified the signature against his identification, and applied her own ink stamp. The loud, definitive thud of the notary stamp echoed through the silent boardroom. It was the sound of a steel door locking shut. Brenda could no longer contain the venomous satisfaction bubbling up inside her. She adjusted her heavy gold necklace, leaning back in her plush leather chair with a deeply arrogant smirk that warped her features. She looked at me not as a human being, but as a minor nuisance they had finally managed to sweep under the rug. "You were always a weak, useless girl, Sienna," she said, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "We knew you would eventually crack under the weight of real consequence. You never had the spine for this family, or this level of wealth. All you have ever done is drain resources and play the professional victim. It is a profound relief to finally cut you loose and put Winston's money where it actually belongs." I kept my head bowed, staring intently at the fibers of the shredded tissue in my hands. The fake tremors continued to shake my shoulders, drawing out the last precious seconds of their illusion. Richard stood up slowly, buttoning his perfectly tailored jacket with an air of absolute finality. He walked around the edge of the massive mahogany table, stopping right beside my chair. He leaned down, placing one hand on the back of my seat and the other flat on the glass, physically boxing me into a manufactured corner. I could smell the sharp, peppery scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with the sour tang of his nervous sweat. He brought his face down until his lips were hovering mere inches from my ear. He wanted to savor this moment to permanently brand his perceived victory into my psychological foundation. "You lose," he whispered, his voice a harsh, triumphant rasp that he intended to send a shiver down my spine. "You always were going to lose to me. You are nothing but a footnote in my legacy now." The notary quietly gathered her ledger, closed her ink pad, and stepped back into the shadows. She gave Mitchell a single, barely perceptible nod. The documents were fully executed. The ink was dry. The transfer of Horizon Holdings and every toxic radioactive liability attached to it was now entirely legally and irrevocably binding. Richard Caldwell was officially the sole undisputed owner. The game was over. I let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the oxygen fill my lungs with crystalline clarity. I opened my hands, allowing the damp, shredded tissue to fall from my grasp. It landed softly on the immaculate glass surface, a piece of discarded trash that had served its purpose. The violent, erratic trembling in my shoulders ceased, instantly replaced by an absolute terrifying stillness. I sat back in my chair, uncoiling my spine until I was sitting perfectly straight. I rolled my shoulders back, the fragile, diminished posture vanishing like smoke in a windstorm. I reached up and smoothly tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, erasing the frantic, disheveled look I had cultivated for the past hour. I slowly turned my head and looked up at Richard. The smug, victorious grin on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened marginally as his brain struggled to process the sudden violent shift in my physical demeanor. There were no tears pooling in my eyes. There was no terror, no panic, no frantic hyperventilation. My gaze was a flat, dead calm, completely empty of any warmth or vulnerability. I looked at him not as a frightened niece begging for mercy, but as the executioner who had just kicked the chair out from under his feet. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Mitchell mirrored my movement, sitting up straight, the facade of the frustrated, defeated attorney instantly evaporating into the air. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his face settling into a mask of cold, predatory professionalism. Across the table, Vance stopped packing his briefcase, his seasoned legal instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the energy in the room. Cameron's frantic bouncing leg abruptly stopped. Even Brenda's arrogant smirk froze in place, her hand pausing midair over the clasp of her designer bag. "Congratulations, Richard," I said. My voice did not shake. It did not crack, waver, or whisper. It resonated through the glass-walled room, a sharp, steady blade slicing cleanly through the heavy silence. The terrified, broken girl they had been mocking just seconds prior was entirely gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute authority that pinned him to the spot. "You are now the sole owner of Horizon Holdings." I continued, my tone completely devoid of any emotion, hollowed out of anything resembling fear or surrender. Richard took a slow, uncertain step back from my chair. The air in his lungs seemed to vanish, leaving his chest hollow. He looked down at the signed contracts, then over to the glowing red timer on my phone, which I calmly reached over and turned off with a single tap, and finally back to my face. The absolute absence of panic in my eyes was a terrifying mirror, reflecting the first dark, creeping edge of his own doom. He had the keys to the empire in his hands, but he was just beginning to realize the crown he had stolen was forged entirely of lead. The silence following my congratulations was absolute. Richard froze, his hand still resting heavily on the back of my chair. He blinked rapidly, his brain misfiring as it struggled to reconcile the weeping broken girl from 30 seconds ago with the cold, unblinking adversary staring back at him. The smug, triumphant sneer that had been permanently etched onto his face began to waver, replaced by a creeping, formless dread. He slowly stood up straight, his eyes darting frantically from my face to the glowing red timer on my phone, which I calmly switched off with a single, deliberate tap, and finally to his attorney. Vance was no longer packing his briefcase. The seasoned lawyer was staring at me with a look of profound, sickening realization, his professional instincts screaming that his client had just walked blindly into a fatal snare. Mitchell stepped forward, completely shattering the remaining tension in the room. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached down and unlatched the secondary hidden compartment of his heavy leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a completely different set of documents. These were not the sanitized, heavily redacted pages we had used to bait the hook and manufacture their frantic greed. These were 3 massive, thick black leather binders. They contained the actual, unredacted, comprehensive financial ledgers of Horizon Holdings. With a smooth, practiced motion, Mitchell lifted the heavy binders and dropped them directly onto the center of the mahogany and glass table. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the quiet, sterile room. The loud, heavy thud echoed off the panoramic windows, physically startling Brenda so badly she dropped her designer handbag onto the carpet. "Open them!" Richard Mitchell commanded. His voice was entirely stripped of the theatrical frustration and defeat he had worn all morning. It was now sharp, authoritative, and surgically precise. "Read exactly what you just purchased with your permanent, irrevocable waiver." Richard snatched the first black binder from the table, his face twisting into a scowl of stubborn, panicked defiance. He ripped open the heavy leather cover, his eyes frantically scanning the top page. He expected to see property deeds, liquid asset accounts, prime commercial real estate holdings, and the keys to a $20 million empire. Instead, his gaze locked onto the bold, glaring columns of bright red ink. He turned the page, the thick paper rustling loudly in the dead quiet of the boardroom. He turned another page, his movements growing violently erratic. The last remnants of his arrogant smile completely dissolved, melting away to reveal a stark, hollow mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his artificial tan looking sickly and gray. "You did not buy a premier real estate firm," Mitchell stated, letting the words hang in the heavy air. The illusion of a $20 million off-the-books asset pool was simply the bait required to secure your signature on that irrevocable transfer. Horizon Holdings contains absolutely zero real estate. It holds no commercial properties, no untraceable liquid capital, and no hidden wealth. Brenda let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her hands flying to her throat as she stared at her husband's ashen face. Vance closed his eyes, slumping back in his chair as the absolute reality of his failure washed over him. He had warned his client, and his client had eagerly signed his own death warrant anyway. "What you just assumed total, personal, and inescapable legal ownership of is a highly specialized financial containment vessel," Mitchell explained, projecting his voice so every syllable landed with devastating, punishing impact. "Horizon Holdings is the sole holding company for exactly $15 million in severely toxic defaulted debt." Richard swayed on his feet, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the edge of the glass table to keep from collapsing. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He stared blankly at the ledgers, reading his own name, his own failing shell companies, his own desperate financial secrets laid bare in stark black and red ink. "Over the past 2 years, Winston Caldwell anticipated your eventual attempt to hostilely assume control of his estate," Mitchell continued, relentlessly ensuring the Caldwells understood the sheer magnitude of their defeat. "He instructed us to quietly purchase your liabilities. Horizon Holdings bought every single one of your defaulted business loans. We acquired the shadow ledgers from the predatory private equity firms you used to fund your lavish lifestyle. We bought the toxic mezzanine debt you hid in offshore accounts. You have been running from a monumental financial collapse for years, Richard. By signing that contract today, you did not trick my client into handing over a fortune. You legally bound yourself to your own inescapable ruin." Mitchell then turned his cold, unwavering gaze toward Cameron. The younger Caldwell was practically vibrating, his eyes wide and completely panicked, staring at the black binders as if they were live explosives. Nia remained seated beside him, perfectly composed, watching the destruction of her abusers with silent, meticulous focus. "And we did not stop with your father," Cameron Mitchell said smoothly, driving the blade deeper. "Horizon Holdings also serves as the primary creditor for a very specific set of underground liabilities." Cameron let out a choked, terrified noise, stumbling backward and knocking his chair into the glass wall. "We purchased your violent syndicate markers," Mitchell clarified, delivering the final crushing blow. "Your $5 million underground gambling debt is now wholly owned by Horizon Holdings. And since your father just aggressively demanded total absolute ownership of Horizon Holdings, your violent debts are now legally his burden to bear. He owns the debt, he owns the defaults, and he owns the immediate crushing liability of $15 million. The air in the boardroom turned completely toxic. The Caldwells were suffocating on their own manufactured greed. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had obliterated them entirely. I let the crushing silence stretch, allowing the devastating reality of Mitchell's words to fully saturate the room. Richard looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff, his mind desperately trying to deny gravity as the ground rushed up to meet him. He stared at his own jagged signature on the settlement agreement, the dark ink sealing his doom with undeniable finality. I finally spoke, my voice completely devoid of the theatrical weakness I had worn like a disguise all morning. You wanted my empire, Richard. I gave you exactly what you asked for. He slowly raised his heavy head, his eyes bloodshot and wide with manic desperation. He opened his mouth to scream to demand the contract be torn up, but I cut him off with a single sharp gesture. Let us be absolutely clear about the legal parameters of the document you just eagerly signed, I stated, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool glass. You bypassed the standard due diligence period because your boundless arrogance blinded you to basic common sense. You demanded and assumed total personal liability for Horizon Holdings. That means you are now legally responsible for every single cent of the $15 million in toxic debt contained within that shell company. Your defaulted business loans, your hidden offshore liabilities, and your son's violent syndicate markers. You own every piece of it. I paused, letting my gaze drift to Vance, who looked physically ill, his professional reputation collapsing alongside his client's finances. But the true brilliance of this transaction, I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper, is the waiver you signed to get those keys. In direct exchange for the holding company, you irrevocably renounced any and all claims to Winston's primary estate. You legally severed all ties to my $80 million fortune. You dropped the probate suit. You withdrew the conservatorship petition. You permanently and perfectly insulated me from your financial ruin. I watched the last spark of hope extinguish in Richard's eyes. You just bought your own bankruptcy, Richard, I told him, delivering the final fatal strike. You built a cage of crushing debt, locked yourself inside, and handed me the only key. I am legally untouchable, and you are completely, undeniably finished. The absolute reality of my words hit the Caldwell side of the table like a runaway freight train. The fragile veneer of their aristocratic superiority violently shattered. Brenda let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The color completely drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. She reached out blindly, her manicured fingers clawing at the empty air for balance, before her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed sideways, her heavy gold jewelry clanking against the glass wall as she slid to the carpet in a dead faint. Richard did not even look down at his unconscious wife. He remained completely paralyzed, trapped in a catatonic state of pure suffocating shock. His chest heaved erratically, but his limbs refused to function. He was a hollowed-out husk of the aggressive patriarch who had marched into this boardroom demanding my unconditional surrender just an hour prior. But Cameron did not freeze. The realization that his violent underground creditors would no longer be paid off by his uncle's estate, that his father was now bankrupt and entirely incapable of shielding him from the impending physical consequences of his gambling debts, completely shattered his fragile mind. The terror in his eyes mutated instantly into raw, feral panic. He let out a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage. "You manipulative witch," Cameron screamed, his voice breaking as spit flew from his lips. He scrambled wildly over the top of the mahogany table, his expensive shoes kicking over leather chairs. He shattered crystal water glasses and sent Mitchell's heavy black binders crashing to the floor, papers scattering like confetti. He lunged directly at me, his hands outstretched like claws, his face twisted into a mask of pure violence. He never made it past the center of the table. The heavy double doors of the boardroom burst open with a deafening crash. Two massive suited security contractors that Mitchell had stationed in the outer hallway stormed the room with brutal, practiced efficiency. Before Cameron's trembling fingers could even graze my sweater, the lead guard grabbed him by the collar of his tailored jacket and violently yanked him backward. Cameron crashed hard against the polished wood, the air driven from his lungs in a sharp, painful wheeze. The second guard instantly pinned his arms behind his back, pressing his face flat against the cold glass surface of the table, neutralizing the threat in a matter of seconds. Amidst the screaming, the shattered glass, and the physical chaos of Cameron thrashing against the guards, Nia finally moved. She stood up from her chair in the far corner of the room, her movements incredibly slow and deliberate. She smoothed the front of her designer skirt, completely ignoring the frantic struggles of her husband pinned to the table just inches away. She walked calmly around the edge of the mahogany, stopping directly in front of Cameron's trapped, furious face. Cameron spat curses at the security guards struggling uselessly against their immense weight. But Nia simply looked down at him with an expression of absolute, chilling indifference. She reached into her sleek leather tote bag and retrieved a thick manila envelope. She did not say a single word. She offered no explanation and no goodbye. She simply dropped the heavy folder directly onto the glass right beside Cameron's cheek. The bold black letters stamped across the front page were impossible to misread. They were expedited divorce proceedings accompanied by a motion for absolute sole legal and physical custody of their children, supported by a mountain of undeniable evidence detailing his severe gambling addiction and violent criminal associations. Nia turned away from him without a second glance. She walked over to where I was standing, her posture radiating quiet strength and total liberation. Mitchell had already packed his briefcase, buttoning his jacket as he surveyed the wreckage of the opposing counsel. I looked at the Caldwells one last time. Richard was hyperventilating, staring blankly at the wall as his world burned to ash. Brenda remained a crumpled heap on the designer carpet. Cameron was weeping in rage and terror, pinned under the weight of the security guards and his own inescapable ruin. The empire they had tried to steal from me had been their ultimate undoing, a poison pill they had swallowed whole. I turned my back on the wreckage of their lives. Nia fell into step beside me, her head held high, stepping over the scattered financial ledgers. Together we walked out of the glass-walled boardroom, leaving the Caldwell family to drown in the shallow, toxic grave they had so eagerly dug for themselves. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind us immediately, muting the sounds of Richard's hyperventilating gasps and Cameron's pathetic, muffled sobbing. The air in the hallway tasted crisp, filtered, and entirely free of their suffocating desperation. Nia and I walked toward the elevator banks without exchanging a single word, our synchronized footsteps echoing sharply on the polished marble floor. We did not need to speak. The devastating silence of our departure was the perfect punctuation mark to the absolute execution we had just orchestrated. Exactly 1 month later, the reality of that afternoon had settled permanently into the bedrock of our lives. The fallout for the Caldwell family was swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. Richard Caldwell's instantaneous blind acquisition of Horizon Holdings had triggered an immediate, unstoppable avalanche of default clauses. The predatory private equity firms and offshore creditors he had spent years dodging wasted no time in claiming their pound of flesh. Within 72 hours of the ink drying on the settlement, the bank aggressively foreclosed on Richard and Brenda's sprawling, ostentatious estate. Their luxury vehicles were repossessed in the dead of night, towed away while the neighbors watched. Their elite country club memberships were instantly revoked, their entire social circle evaporating the very moment the undeniable scent of bankruptcy hit the air. But the absolute financial ruin was only the beginning of their nightmare. Mitchell had anonymously forwarded a comprehensive, meticulously documented dossier of Richard's creative accounting practices, complete with his newly acquired, highly illegal shadow ledgers, directly to the federal authorities. Richard and Brenda were now facing multiple severe counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud a legal estate. Their passports had been seized by federal agents. Their few remaining legally frozen accounts were currently being drained by bottom-tier defense attorneys who demanded retainers up front. They were presently confined to a cramped, poorly ventilated leased apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, awaiting a criminal trial they could not possibly win. Cameron did not stay to face the music with his parents. The precise moment the underground syndicates realized his uncle's lucrative estate was no longer a viable payout option, their aggressive threats turned immediately physical. The violent men holding his $5 million markers came looking to collect, and they did not care about legal technicalities. Cameron abandoned his mother, his father, and his complete lack of responsibility, fleeing the state in a panicked, desperate scramble for his life. He was officially a fugitive, living completely off the grid, constantly looking over his shoulder forever, hunted by the very demons he had so willingly invited into his orbit. His absolute cowardice was his final defining act. Nia, conversely, had never looked more vibrant or alive. She had executed her exit strategy with the exact same ruthless precision we had applied to the holding company trap. Using the heavily documented leverage of Cameron's criminal gambling debts and the undeniable imminent physical threat they posed to her children, the family court judge had granted her emergency petition, without a fraction of hesitation. She was awarded absolute sole legal and physical custody, alongside a permanent restraining order that legally vaporized Cameron's presence from their lives. She had seamlessly relocated to a beautiful, secure home in a quiet coastal town, a fresh start entirely funded by the generous anonymous trust I had happily established for my niece and nephew. Nia was thriving, launching her own boutique consulting agency, and finally breathing clean air completely free from the toxic, suffocating weight of the Caldwell name. We spoke weekly, not as former in-laws forced together by an unfortunate circumstance, but as equals who had survived the fire and forged a genuine, unbreakable bond. As for my own life, the dust had completely and beautifully settled. The emergency conservatorship petition had been thrown out of probate court the very morning after the boardroom massacre, dismissed with extreme prejudice by a judge who saw Richard's desperate actions for exactly what they were. My mental fitness was no longer a subject of debate or a weapon to be used against me. The vicious whisper campaigns, the manufactured doubts, the insidious narrative they had tried to spin about my fragile state of mind had all been utterly obliterated. I returned to my corporate law firm not as a recovering victim, but as a proven conqueror. The managing partners, having witnessed the absolute surgical dismantling of a hostile takeover bid on a multi-million-dollar estate, recognized the undeniable caliber of the woman standing before them. The promotion I had spent years relentlessly grinding for was finalized in a matter of days. I was officially named senior partner, my name etched in crisp silver lettering on the heavy glass door of my new expansive corner suite. But the true resounding victory was not found in my corporate title or my professional accolades. It was found in the quiet, undisturbed sanctuary of Winston's primary office. I stood behind his massive antique oak desk, running my fingers lightly over the polished wood grain. The room still smelled faintly of his favored leather bindings and the subtle, sharp tang of the expensive espresso he used to brew every morning. I had spent the last month meticulously organizing his vast empire, securing his legitimate philanthropic trusts, fortifying the massive commercial real estate portfolios, and ensuring that his vision would operate flawlessly for generations to come. I had protected my true father's legacy with a ferocity that would have made him immensely proud. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The late afternoon sun painted the towering glass skyscrapers in brilliant strokes of gold and amber, casting long, sharp shadows over the bustling streets below. For years, I had allowed the Caldwells to occupy space in my mind, tolerating their endless greed and their venomous entitlement out of some misplaced, lingering sense of familial obligation. I had let them drain my energy, manipulate my kindness, and threaten my sanity. But that era was permanently closed. I had drawn an ironclad boundary in the sand, and when they aggressively tried to cross it, I had simply let them engineer their own total destruction. The toxic, heavy anchors of my past had been completely, irrevocably cut loose. I stood alone in the golden light, feeling the absolute stillness of the room, the profound, unshakable safety of my empire, and the undeniable strength of my own mind. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, unrestricted breath of clean air. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I was finally, truly free. The story of Sienna and the Caldwells teaches a profound lesson about toxic relationships and unchecked greed. Richard was completely destroyed, not by brute force but by his blinding arrogance and ravenous appetite for sudden wealth. Sienna proves that true strength never requires loud aggression. Real power lies in quiet strategy and the courage to establish firm boundaries. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat master manipulators is simply stepping backward and letting their toxic nature completely consume them. Ultimately, you must always prioritize protecting your inner peace. Have you ever escaped a highly manipulative family dynamic? Please comment below.